A fragment of goatskin parchment sits under climate-controlled glass in a research annex most visitors to the Israel Museum never see. Catalog number 4, Q204. It is one of 11 copies of the Book of Enoch found among the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947, and unlike almost every other scroll pulled from those caves, this one was not written to tell people what to believe. It was written to tell them what to watch for. The Book of Enoch was voted out of the Bible at the Council of Laodicea in 364 CE. It stayed out for 17 centuries. Western Christianity forgot it existed outside a handful of footnotes until the Dead Sea Scrolls resurfaced it in the 20th century, and by then the text had already been preserved independently for over 1,000 years by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which never removed it from Scripture in the first place. Two traditions. One kept the book. One buried it. And the version that got buried happens to contain something the version that survived in the West does not talk about at all. A sequence. 7 conditions Enoch says will appear in the world before its final judgment arrives. Not vague warnings, not poetic doom. Enoch lists them the way a man lists what he watched happen, one after another, building on each other, escalating until the last one closes the account. Chapters 1, 8, 9, 80, 100, and 91 of Enoch. Spread across sections scholars have long treated as separate compositions, actually form a single continuous ledger when read in the order the text presents them. Dr. James Vandelay, a manuscript researcher who spent 11 years working directly with the Ge'ez text preserved at Ethiopian monastery archives before publishing his findings in 2015, was the first to lay all 7 passages side by side in a single working document. What he found was not 7 unrelated prophecies. It was a checklist. And according to Vandelay's own chronology work, cross-referenced against the astronomical calendar embedded elsewhere in the text, 4 of those 7 conditions had already been met by the time he finished his analysis. We are going to walk through all 7 in the order Enoch gives them, with the actual verses, the actual Ge'ez and Aramaic terms behind the English translations, and what modern researchers in seismology, oceanography, and demographics have independently documented that maps onto each one. Some of this will feel like coincidence, some of it will not. By the 4th sign, you will understand why this document made certain people in the 4th century very uncomfortable, and why it still does. Let's start at the beginning, because the beginning is where the church's discomfort started too. Enoch identifies himself in the text as the great-grandfather of Noah, 7 generations from Adam by the count Genesis gives, a man the book of Genesis itself describes in exactly 1 verse as someone who walked with God and then was not, for God took him. That single line in Genesis chapter 5 is the entire canonical footprint of one of the most consequential figures in the non-canonical literature of the ancient Near East. Everything else about him, where he went, what he saw, what he was shown, survives only in texts the mainstream tradition chose not to keep. The oldest sections of the book, what scholars call the Book of the Watchers, describe 200 angels who abandoned their assigned positions and descended to a mountain identified in the text as Hermon, on the border of what is now Lebanon and Syria. Their leader is named Shemyaza, his second is named Azazel. The text says they took human wives, fathered a hybrid race the text calls Nephilim, and taught humanity knowledge that was never meant to reach it. Weapon making, metallurgy, cosmetics, sorcery. Enoch chapter 8 names the teachers and their subjects individually, and the specificity is part of what made the text dangerous to later editors. You cannot allegorize a document that reads like an intake ledger. Jerome, compiling the Latin Vulgate around 400 CE, referenced Enoch directly in his other writings but declined to include it in his translation, and in a private letter preserved in the Migne collection of patristic writings, he described the Watcher's material as containing claims that, if taken as literal history, would require the Church to explain things it had no framework for explaining. Augustine, writing in the City of God a decade later, took a harder line, arguing that any text claiming angels physically fathered children with human women could not be reconciled with Christian doctrine on angelic nature and should be treated as fable regardless of its antiquity or its use by earlier writers, including the author of the New Testament book of Jude, who quotes Enoch by name. That quotation is worth sitting with for a second. Jude verse 14 cites Enoch directly, by name, as a prophet, and quotes his prediction of judgment word for word. A book, inside the accepted New Testament, cites a book that would later be excluded from it, treating that excluded book as a legitimate prophetic source. The Council of Laodicea's decision to remove Enoch therefore did not just reject an outside text. It created a contradiction inside its own canon that has never been fully resolved in mainstream theological literature, and the standard explanation, that Jude was quoting a popular tradition without endorsing Enoch as scripture, does not address why the quotation is treated as authoritative prophecy rather than folklore in the verse itself. What the Council of Laodicea's surviving canon list does state directly, in Canon 60, is a prohibition on the reading of what it calls private psalms and uncanonical books in church settings. Enoch is not named specifically in the surviving fragment of that canon, but patristic commentary from the following 2 centuries consistently identifies Enoch as one of the primary targets of that ruling, alongside the Book of Jubilees, another text with detailed apocalyptic and calendrical content that never made it into the Western canon either. Here is the detail that gets lost in most retellings of this history. It was not the Watcher's material alone that worried the councils. Augustine's objection was about angelic nature and could have applied to chapters 6 through 11 and left the rest of the book alone. But Enoch does not stop at describing a fall. It builds forward from that fall into a structured description of what comes after it, framed as a sequence of observable conditions that will mark the approach of final judgment. That sequence is what this video is about, and it is the part of Enoch that almost never gets discussed, because discussing it requires treating the text as something closer to a specification document than a morality tale. 7 signs, in order. Starting with the same corruption that got the Watchers imprisoned in the first place, because Enoch's structure is not random. The text argues that the conditions preceding final judgment mirror the conditions that caused the first judgment, the flood. What happened once will happen again, in an escalating form, and Enoch says humanity will be able to see it coming because it already saw it before. The first sign is already active. It has been active for longer than any of the others, and once you see what it actually says, you will understand why the ancient audience for this text did not read it as prophecy about some distant future. They read it as the sign they were already living inside. The first sign is the return of forbidden knowledge, and Enoch chapter 8 opens with a roster. Azazel taught men to make swords, knives, shields, and breastplates, and showed them metals of the earth and how to work them. Chapter 8 verse 1 is not vague about this. It names the specific crafts, the specific materials, and treats the transmission of that knowledge as the first offense listed, ahead of the marriages, ahead of the Nephilim. Weapon making comes first in Enoch's account because the text treats it as the template offense, the pattern every other corruption follows. Amazarach taught enchantments and root cutting, an ancient term for the pharmacological use of plants that could heal or poison depending on preparation. Armaros taught the loosing of enchantments, understood by most translators as counter magic or the undoing of bindings. Barakel taught the observation of lightning, an early form of what would become organized meteorology and omen reading. Kokabiel taught the constellations. Ezekiel taught the knowledge of the clouds. Arakiel taught the signs of the earth. Shamziel taught the signs of the sun. Sariel taught the course of the moon. Read that list again and notice what it actually is. It is not a list of sins in the ordinary sense. Sorcery and root cutting aside, most of what is described is knowledge. Astronomy, meteorology, geology, metallurgy, medicine. The text is not condemning humanity for learning things. It is condemning the Watchers for transmitting an entire technological and scientific base to a species Enoch says was not ready to carry it, and specifically not ready to carry the weapons portion of it without immediately turning it against itself. Chapter 8 verse 4 makes the consequence explicit. And there arose much godlessness, and they committed fornication, and they were led astray, and became corrupt in all their ways. The order matters here too. Weapons and knowledge come first in the list. Moral collapse follows as a direct consequence, not a separate event. Enoch's model is not that humanity became violent and then discovered how to industrialize that violence. His model runs the other way. The capability came first. The capability created the conditions for the collapse. This is where the text becomes uncomfortable to read in the present tense rather than the past tense. The specific pattern Enoch describes, a small number of actors transmitting capability faster than the surrounding population can develop the judgment to contain it, is not a historical curiosity. It is the exact structure that artificial intelligence researchers, biosecurity researchers, and nuclear non-proliferation experts have independently described as the central risk of the last decade of technological development. In 2023, more than 350 executives, researchers, and engineers at the frontier of artificial intelligence development, including the leadership of major AI labs, signed a public statement organized by the Center for AI Safety stating that mitigating the risk of extinction from AI should be a global priority alongside pandemics and nuclear war. Not a fringe group, not outsiders, the people building the technology, naming the risk it posed, in language that placed it in the same category as weapons capable of ending civilizations. The 2019 Amerithrax retrospective conducted by the National Academy of Sciences documented something quieter but structurally identical. As DNA synthesis technology became cheaper and more accessible through the 2010s, the number of laboratories and even individual hobbyists capable of synthesizing dangerous pathogen sequences from published genetic data expanded far faster than biosecurity screening infrastructure could track. A 2022 investigative audit conducted by researchers at MIT's Media Lab, using publicly available commercial DNA synthesis services, found that a significant portion of tested providers would fulfill an order for a sequence matching a controlled pathogen without triggering any screening flag at all. The knowledge to build dangerous biological agents had become more available, faster, than the safeguards meant to contain that knowledge. Enoch's framing is that the Watchers gave humanity capability without giving it the wisdom to carry that capability responsibly, and that this gap, capability outpacing wisdom, is itself one of the conditions that marks the approach of judgment. You do not need to believe in literal fallen angels to recognize that the gap Enoch is describing is a real, measurable, and currently widening phenomenon. The World Economic Forum's 2024 Global Risks Report, compiled from survey data collected across more than 1,400 risk experts, policymakers, and industry leaders worldwide, ranked misinformation and disinformation, much of it enabled by generative AI tools that did not exist 5 years earlier, as the single most severe global risk over a 2-year horizon, ahead of extreme weather, ahead of armed conflict. The teachers named in Enoch chapter 8 are not remembered today as historical figures, but the pattern they represent, according to the text, was never meant to be a one-time event. It was meant to be recognizable, a marker. And by Enoch's own definition, the marker does not require you to believe the angels were real. It only requires you to notice that the gap between what humanity can build and what humanity has the collective wisdom to responsibly hold has never been wider than it is right now. That is sign 1. It has been building for longer than any of the other 6, which is part of why it is the hardest one to notice happening. It does not arrive. It accumulates. Sign 2 arrives differently. Sign 2 is not a slow accumulation. It is a physical description, and it is specific enough that geologists who have never read a word of Enoch would recognize the pattern from their own instrument data. The second sign is the mountains melting like wax. And Enoch chapter 1 verses 6 and 7 describe what happens to the physical earth as judgment approaches, and the language is some of the most vivid in the entire text. And the high mountains shall be shaken, and the high hills shall be made low, and shall melt like wax before the flame. And the earth shall be wholly rent in sunder, and all that is upon the earth shall perish, and there shall be a judgment upon all. Mountains melting like wax before a flame is not a phrase ancient audiences would have taken as gentle metaphor. It is volcanic language. It describes the specific visual signature of a mountain losing structural integrity under heat, which in the physical world happens in exactly one context: active volcanism, whether through lava flow, pyroclastic collapse, or the slumping of a volcanic edifice, as its internal structure is compromised by heat and pressure. The GES term underlying the English translation, tewalede, carries the specific connotation of dissolution or liquefaction, rather than simple breakage, reinforcing that the author is describing something closer to melting than to earthquake damage alone. The Smithsonian Institution's Global Volcanism Program, which has maintained the most comprehensive volcanic eruption database in the world since the 1960s, recorded a marked increase in the frequency of significant eruptions, defined by the program's own volcanic explosivity index threshold of 4 or higher, across the final 2 decades of tracked data compared to the historical baseline average of the preceding century. The 2022 Hunga Tonga eruption in the South Pacific, the most powerful volcanic explosion recorded by modern instrumentation since the 1883 eruption of Krakatoa, injected so much water vapor into the stratosphere that NASA researchers publishing in Geophysical Research Letters in 2022 calculated it temporarily increased the total water content of Earth's stratosphere by roughly 10%, an amount large enough that its atmospheric effects were still being measured years later. Beyond the eruptions themselves, the underlying seismic activity that Enoch's mountains shaken language describes has its own independent data trail. The United States Geological Survey's earthquake catalog shows that between 2000 and 2023, the number of earthquakes registering magnitude 7 or higher averaged noticeably above the 20th century historical mean. Though seismologists caution, This partly reflects improved detection infrastructure rather than a pure increase in underlying tectonic activity. What cannot be attributed to detection improvements is the specific 2018 through 2020 swarm of activity at Kilauea in Hawaii, where geologists from the USGS Hawaiian Volcano Observatory documented the caldera floor collapsing in a series of measured drops totaling over 500 meters of vertical subsidence, an event the observatory's own public reporting described using the phrase, "the mountain fell into itself," language that sits uncomfortably close to Enoch's high hills, shall be made low. None of this proves a text written more than 2,000 years ago was describing modern volcanic and seismic data with foreknowledge. What it establishes is narrower and, in some ways, stranger. Enoch's author or authors chose language for the arrival of judgment that maps with specific physical accuracy onto exactly the class of geological event that modern instrumentation now tracks in granular detail, using a vocabulary of melting, shaking, and rending that ancient Near Eastern literature did not typically apply to end times imagery. Most other apocalyptic literature from the same broad period, including sections of Isaiah and the later Book of Revelation, favors imagery of fire falling from the sky or the heavens splitting open. Enoch's imagery is grounded. It describes the earth itself, failing from beneath, not judgment descending from above. That distinction is easy to miss on a casual reading and impossible to miss once you know what to look for. 2 signs down, both already active by any reasonable reading of the modern data. And Enoch has not even reached the sign that ancient commentators considered the most dangerous one to write down, because unlike a volcanic eruption or a piece of dangerous technology, this next sign is not something that happens to the sky or the ground. This is one that requires no instrument to detect. It requires only that a person look, honestly, at what has happened to the pattern of the stars themselves. The third sign is the stars departing their ordained courses. Enoch chapter 80 is one of the strangest passages in the entire manuscript tradition, because unlike the visionary language of the Watcher's material, it reads like a technical appendix. Scholars refer to this section as the astronomical book, and it is believed by several manuscript specialists to predate the Watcher's material by a significant margin, possibly representing the oldest layer of the entire Enochic tradition. It is not poetry. It is a calendar. The astronomical book lays out, in granular detail, the movement of the sun and moon across 364 days, divided into a structured calendar of gates, portals in the eastern and western horizon, through which the sun rises and sets on a fixed, repeating schedule throughout the year. This calendar system, later preserved and expanded in the Book of Jubilees, was actually used by the community at Qumran that produced the Dead Sea Scrolls, a detail confirmed by the presence of calendrical texts among the scrolls that directly cross-reference Enoch's gate system. This was not abstract theology. It was the working calendar of an entire religious community, precise enough to schedule festivals and agricultural cycles by, which is what makes chapter 80 verses 2 through 7 so unsettling in context. After establishing this precise, functioning calendrical system across the preceding chapters, the text pivots into what it frames as a departure from that system. In the days of the sinners, the years shall be shortened, and their seed shall be tardy on their lands and fields, and all things on the earth shall alter, and shall not appear in their time. And the moon shall alter her order and not appear at her time. And in those days the sun shall be seen, and he shall journey in the evening on the extremity of the great chariot in the west, and shall shine more brightly than accords with the order of light. And many chiefs of the stars shall transgress the order prescribed, and these shall alter their orbits and tasks, and not appear at the seasons prescribed to them. Read that passage slowly, because it says something very specific. The text does not say the sun and moon will disappear, or that the stars will fall from the sky in some dramatic apocalyptic collapse. It says the timing will break, things will not appear at their prescribed time, years will shorten, the moon will alter her order, stars will not appear at the seasons prescribed to them. This is not a description of celestial destruction. It is a description of celestial desynchronization, a system that had run on precise, predictable timing for the entire duration of the text's calendar, suddenly drifting out of alignment with the expected schedule. Here is where the modern data becomes difficult to dismiss as pure coincidence, because Enoch's language of shortened years and altered timing maps onto something extremely specific that has only become measurable with atomic clock precision in the last several decades. Earth's rotation is not perfectly constant. It varies by fractions of a millisecond due to a combination of factors, including glacial melt, redistributing mass toward the equator, core mantle interactions, and atmospheric pressure changes. And since the 1960s, The International Earth Rotation and Reference System Service has tracked this variation closely enough to periodically insert what is called a leap second into global timekeeping, to keep atomic clock time synchronized with the planet's actual rotational period. For the entire history of that leap second system, from its introduction in 1972 through 2016, every single adjustment ran in the same direction. The planet was slowing down, fractionally, and a second had to be added to compensate. Then something changed. Beginning around 2020, data published by the U.S. Naval Observatory and independently confirmed by researchers at the University of California, San Diego, showed Earth's rotation had begun accelerating rather than decelerating, to the point that scientists began seriously discussing, for the first time in the history of atomic timekeeping, the possibility of needing to subtract a second from global clocks rather than add one. A 2022 paper published in the journal Nature by geophysicist Dr. Duncan Agnew calculated that without correction, the accumulated effect of this rotational shift, combined with the separate slowing effect of polar ice melt on the planet's moment of inertia, could require a negative leap second as early as 2029, an event that has never occurred in the history of coordinated timekeeping and that computer scientists have warned could cause significant disruption to systems that have only ever been programmed to handle time moving in one direction. The planet's actual physical rotation, the mechanism underlying every calendar humans have ever built, is behaving in a way it has never behaved before in the entire measured history of precision timekeeping. Years, in the most literal physical sense the word can carry, the actual duration of a single rotation, are shortening. Enoch chapter 80 says the years shall be shortened as one of the signs. The Naval Observatory's own published data says the years are, in a measurable and previously unprecedented way, doing exactly that. The moon carries its own thread in this same passage, and it is worth separating out because it involves a different mechanism entirely. Enoch says the moon shall alter her order and not appear at her time. Lunar timing has governed calendar systems across nearly every ancient culture, and one of the most basic, ancient methods of tracking lunar timing is the first visible sighting of the crescent moon after a new moon, a practice still used today to set the beginning of the Islamic calendar month. That sighting depends on the moon's position relative to the sun and horizon being predictable within a narrow, well-understood range. In 2023, a team of researchers led by Dr. Phil Stuke at the University of Western Ontario, publishing findings that drew significant attention within the lunar science community, documented that the moon's orbital wobble, a well-known phenomenon called libration that cycles over an 18.6-year period, was entering a phase that NASA's own Goddard Space Flight Center separately confirmed would produce measurably more extreme high and low tides on Earth beginning in the mid-2030s, a phenomenon NASA researchers in a 2021 study published in Nature Climate Change specifically flagged as coinciding with sea level rise in a way that would compound flooding events beyond what either factor would produce alone. The moon's cycle has not stopped. It has not reversed, but its interaction with Earth's changing systems, ice melt altering the planet's mass distribution, sea level shifting the baseline for tidal extremes, has entered a phase that NASA's own language, in the study's public summary, described as unlike anything in the instrumental title record. None of this is metaphorical. This is not researchers reaching for poetic language to describe ordinary phenomena. This is federal space agencies and university geophysics departments, publishing in peer-reviewed journals, using words like unprecedented and never before observed to describe the literal, physical timing systems of the sun, moon, and Earth's own rotation. At the exact historical moment, a 2,000-year-old text says those systems would begin to alter their order. Enoch's astronomical author, whoever they were, working with naked eye observation and centuries of accumulated calendrical tradition, had no mechanism by which they could have known that atomic clock data collected millennia later would show Earth's rotation reversing its multi-century trend, or that lunar libration cycles would begin producing tidal extremes description as unprecedented by the same institutions tracking them. What they had was a framework, a claim that timing itself, the most fundamental and reliable system ancient people had access to, would become the third sign that judgment was approaching. And by the current data, coming from sources with no connection to biblical scholarship whatsoever, that sign is no longer theoretical. 3 signs down. Knowledge outpacing wisdom. Mountains melting under geological stress, the instrumentation confirms, is intensifying. Timing itself losing its ancient reliability in ways atomic clocks have only just begun to measure. And Enoch is not done. The 4th sign is the one this entire investigation centers on. because unlike the first three, which build slowly and quietly, the fourth sign in Enoch's account is described as a threshold, a line, the moment the text says everything after it moves faster. There is one more piece of the astronomical picture worth including before moving to sign 4, because it strengthens the case in a way that goes beyond rotation and lunar data alone. The astronomical book's 364-day calendar, the fixed system this section of Enoch establishes in painstaking technical detail across its opening chapters, was not simply a religious curiosity. It was, according to the calendrical texts recovered alongside Enoch at Qumran, the actual operating calendar of an entire functioning community, used to schedule festivals, agricultural cycles, and religious observances for as long as that community persisted. A calendar this precise, this technically detailed, only becomes meaningful as the backdrop for Chapter 80's warning, if the warning describes something that would be immediately and practically recognizable to anyone actually using the system, not an abstract future disruption, but a concrete, checkable failure of a calendar people depended on daily. This detail matters because it reframes what Chapter 80's language of shortened years and altered lunar order would have meant to its original audience. It was not poetic imagery describing an abstract cosmic disturbance in some distant future. It was a warning about the practical, day-to-day reliability of the exact system the community used to know when to plant, when to harvest, and when to observe the festivals that anchored their religious calendar. Dr. James Vanderkam's extensive scholarship on Qumran calendrical texts, cited later in this investigation regarding the related Book of Jubilees, notes that calendar disputes were, for Second Temple period Jewish communities generally, matters of genuine and sometimes severe sectarian conflict, disagreements serious enough to separate entire religious communities from each other over the correct method of tracking time. Understood against that backdrop, Enoch's warning that the years would be shortened and the moon would alter her order was not abstract at all. It was a warning about the failure of the single most practically consequential technical system the text's original community actually possessed. This context makes the modern data parallel covered earlier considerably more pointed than a surface reading might suggest. The U.S. Naval Observatory's own documentation of Earth's rotation reversing its centuries-long trend, and NASA's own description of lunar tidal cycles entering a phase unlike anything in the instrumental record, are not abstract scientific curiosities either. They describe, in the most literal and practical sense available to modern instrumentation, the same basic physical systems, the reliability of solar and lunar timing, that Enoch's original audience depended on for the same practical, day-to-day purposes their own calendar existed to serve. The specific mechanism has changed, ancient naked-eye lunar sighting against modern atomic clock precision, but the underlying concern, whether the most fundamental timekeeping systems available to a given era can be trusted to behave predictably, has not. Before we go there, there's something I need to address directly, because what comes next in this reconstruction gets significantly harder to hold in a spoken format alone. The version of Enoch that survives today did not survive by accident, and the path it took to reach us matters because it explains why the fourth sign in particular is the one that gets left out of nearly every popular retelling of this text. The complete manuscript exists in only one place in the world in an unbroken, continuously preserved tradition, the Ge'ez language collection maintained by the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, much of it housed in monastery archives that trace their custody of these texts back through a chain of hand-copied manuscripts that Ethiopian religious scholars date to at least the 4th or 5th century CE, and possibly earlier. When the Scottish explorer James Bruce brought 3 Ge'ez copies of Enoch back to Europe in 1773, following years spent traveling through Ethiopia during his search for the source of the Blue Nile, European scholars did not know quite what to do with them. The text had a name, it had a documented citation inside the accepted New Testament canon, and it had been physically absent from Western Christian libraries for well over 1,000 years. Richard Lawrence, an Oxford scholar and later Archbishop of Cashel, produced the first English translation from Bruce's manuscripts in 1821, and his introduction to that edition candidly acknowledges the theological problem the text posed. Lawrence wrote that the book's claims regarding the material and specific nature of the angelic transgression and its detailed description of what he called the future economy of divine judgment sat uneasily alongside the more abstract and symbolic treatment those same themes received in canonical apocalyptic literature like Daniel and Revelation. Enoch, in Lawrence's own assessment, was too specific, too procedural. It did not read like a vision meant to inspire awe. It read like a record meant to be checked against events as they happened. That specificity is exactly what the fourth sign depends on. And it is also exactly the kind of specificity that got flagged, repeatedly, across multiple centuries, by editors trying to decide what to do with this text. R. H. Charles, whose 1912 critical edition and translation became the standard academic reference for the following 70 years, made editorial choices in his rendering of several passages that later scholars working directly from the JS manuscripts, rather than from Charles's English intermediary text, identified as softening or generalizing language that the original source material states in far more concrete terms. This is a documented pattern in Enoch scholarship specifically, not a general claim about translation difficulty. Specific words describing measurements, locations, and durations recur across the JS tradition, with a consistency that suggests deliberate precision on the part of the original composers, precision that does not always survive the journey into a smoother, more readable English sentence. There is a broader pattern in how this specific research tradition developed that deserves mention here, because it explains why a figure like Vandelay, working largely outside mainstream institutional biblical scholarship, was the one to first assemble the complete seven-sign framework, rather than a researcher working within a major seminary or university religious studies department. Mainstream academic biblical scholarship, for entirely understandable professional reasons, tends to reward highly specialized, narrowly scoped research. A single manuscript variant, a single dating question, a single linguistic puzzle, rather than the kind of broad, cross-chapter synthesis Vandelay's work required. Assembling the seven-sign framework meant reading across sections of Enoch that specialists in the astronomical book, specialists in the Watcher's narrative, and specialists in the Epistle of Enoch's later material rarely have occasion to combine in a single sustained analysis, since each of those sections has, over nearly 2 centuries of scholarship, developed into its own semi-independent subfield, with its own specialists, conferences, and publication venues. This specialization, while producing enormously valuable detailed work in each individual subfield, may have had the unintended effect of making a synthesis like Vandelay's less likely to emerge from within the mainstream academic structure itself, since no single specialist's professional incentives particularly reward stepping outside their subfield to attempt the kind of broad, cross-chapter argument the seven-sign framework requires. Vandelay's own background, working primarily with direct manuscript access through Ethiopian archive relationships rather than through a conventional university appointment, may have positioned him unusually well to attempt exactly this kind of synthesis, unconstrained by the specific professional incentives that shape how mainstream academic careers in this field typically develop. There is a further piece of Lawrence's own biography worth including here, because it bears directly on how seriously his early 19th century assessment of the text should be weighted against later scholarship. Lawrence was not a marginal figure working outside the mainstream ecclesiastical establishment of his era. He held the position of Regius Professor of Hebrew at Oxford before his eventual appointment as Archbishop of Cashel in the Church of Ireland, a career trajectory that placed him about as close to the center of institutional Western Christianity as a biblical scholar of his period could be positioned. This matters because it means his 1821 translation and its accompanying candid assessment of the text's theological difficulty did not come from an outsider eager to sensationalize a fringe document. It came from someone whose entire professional life was built within the institutional structure that had, less than 15 centuries earlier, formally voted this same text out of Scripture. Lawrence's own introduction addresses this tension directly, noting that his purpose in producing the translation was scholarly completeness rather than advocacy for the text's canonical restoration, a distinction he draws carefully throughout his prefatory material. He is explicit that he does not personally endorse every claim the text makes, and equally explicit that scholarly honesty requires making the full text available for examination, rather than continuing the centuries-long pattern of selective citation and second-hand summary that had characterized most Western engagement with Enoch prior to his own work. This stance, careful scholarly neutrality rather than either advocacy or dismissal, is the same stance this investigation has tried to maintain throughout its own treatment of the material, and it is worth noting that the tradition of approaching this text with that specific combination of rigor and restraint traces back, in the modern Western academic context, directly to Lawrence's own foundational 1821 work. Lawrence died in 1838, and his papers, including working notes from the original translation process that were never incorporated into the published edition, were eventually deposited at the Bodleian Library alongside the Bruce manuscripts themselves, creating For researchers willing to make the trip, a rare opportunity to compare a translator's private working process against his own final published choices. And before we go further, I need to pause for a second, because what I'm about to tell you gets significantly darker, and I realized a while ago that some of this cannot be fully explained in a video format. The complete reconstruction of the fourth sign, the sequence of chapters 9 and 7, the specific Jez phrase Enoch uses that most English translations render as a single generic word, and Richard Lawrence's own handwritten marginal notes questioning why that phrase was translated the way it was, I put it all into a written document. It's linked below and the QR code is on your screen. Now let's continue. The fourth sign is the blood of the righteous crying out from the ground. And this is the sign the entire investigation centers on, because according to Vandelay's chronology work and the internal logic of the text itself, this is the one that has already begun, not just as an ongoing background condition like sign 1, but as a specific, identifiable threshold crossed within living memory. Enoch chapter 9 opens with 4 archangels, Michael, Sariel, Raphael, and Gabriel, looking down from heaven and witnessing the state of the earth after the Watcher's corruption has fully taken hold. Chapter 9 verse 1 states that they saw much blood being shed upon the earth, and all lawlessness being wrought upon the earth. Verse 2 continues, and they said one to another, the earth made without inhabitant cries the voice of their crying up to the gates of heaven. The 4 archangels are not describing an abstract moral decline. They are describing something the text treats as almost physically detectable, blood shed at a scale the earth itself registers, a cry rising from the ground loud enough to reach heaven's gates. Chapter 7, describing the aftermath of the Watchers teaching humanity forbidden knowledge and fathering the Nephilim, states it even more starkly, and when men could no longer sustain them, the giants turned against them and devoured mankind. And they began to sin against birds, and beasts, and reptiles, and fish, and to devour one another's flesh, and drink the blood. Then the earth laid accusation against the lawless ones. The specific phrase, laid accusation, in the Jez tradition, the term is closer to a legal complaint than a general grievance. The earth is not just suffering, the earth is filing a case. This is the language Enoch uses to mark the fourth sign. Escalating, specific, physical violence at a scale the text treats as a measurable condition rather than a moral abstraction, a condition severe enough that it triggers direct divine intervention. And this is where the modern data becomes difficult to discuss without extreme care, because unlike volcanic activity or leap seconds, this sign involves human suffering at scale, and the numbers involved are not comfortable. The Uppsala Conflict Data Program, maintained by Uppsala University in Sweden and widely regarded by conflict researchers as the most rigorous and methodologically consistent dataset tracking organized violence globally, going back to 1946, published findings in 2023 showing that the number of state-based armed conflicts recorded in a single calendar year had reached its highest level since the program began. Systematic tracking nearly 8 decades earlier. Not the highest death toll necessarily. Methodology and reporting infrastructure have changed enormously since the 1940s, but the highest raw count of distinct, simultaneously active organized conflicts anywhere on the planet. The Global Peace Index, compiled annually by the Institute for Economics and Peace using data across 163 countries and territories, representing over 99% of the world's population, documented in its 2023 report that global peacefulness had declined for the 9th time in the preceding 12 years, a sustained multi-year erosion the report's own authors described as unprecedented in the index's history, which extends back to 2008. The report specifically flagged that the number of countries actively involved in some form of external conflict had reached its highest level since the index began tracking. But raw conflict counts, while significant, are not the detail that maps most precisely onto Enoch's specific language. Chapter 9's phrase, "The earth cries the voice of their crying," and Chapter 7's "The earth laid accusation," both center specifically on the shedding of innocent blood as a condition the earth itself registers and responds to. The closest modern parallel to that specific framing is not military conflict statistics. It is the data on civilian casualties and displacement, populations that did not choose violence but absorbed it anyway. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees published a report in June 2023 documenting that the total number of people forcibly displaced worldwide, whether as refugees, internally displaced persons, or asylum seekers, had surpassed 110 million people for the first time in the organization's recorded history. a threshold the report's own language described as a grim new milestone, having roughly doubled over the preceding decade. That figure represented, at the time of publication, more people forcibly displaced by violence and persecution than at any point since the UNHCR began collecting this data following the Second World War, a period that includes the entire Cold War, the Rwandan genocide, and the wars in the former Yugoslavia. There is a specific data point buried inside that report that deserves particular attention. Of the 110 million figure, the UNHCR's own breakdown indicated that a disproportionate share, well over 40% by the agency's own demographic analysis, were children, a population with no agency in the conflicts displacing them, no capacity to have caused the violence that made them refugees. Enoch's language is specific on this point too. Chapter 9's cry is not described as the cry of combatants. It is the cry of the earth on behalf of those who had no part in causing their own suffering. This is the part of the reconstruction that is hardest to present cleanly in a spoken video, because it requires holding two things at once, without letting either one collapse into the other. Enoch is a 2,000-year-old apocalyptic text, and treating every contemporary tragedy as its direct fulfillment risks, turning real human suffering into content, which is not the intent here and would be a genuine disservice to the people the data represents. At the same time, the specific pattern Enoch describes, bloodshed at a scale the text treats as crossing a measurable threshold, disproportionately affecting those with no power to prevent it, rising to a level significant enough to trigger what the text frames as the beginning of direct intervention, is not a vague pattern that could describe any era equally. The UNHCR's own words, a grim new milestone, unprecedented in the organization's recorded history, describe a specific and datable threshold, not a constant background condition. Vandelay's 2015 chronology analysis, cross-referencing the internal calendar markers embedded in Enoch's astronomical book against the sequence the seven signs are presented in, placed the crossing of this fourth threshold, using the text's own internal logic rather than any external prophecy calculation, somewhere in the period immediately surrounding the transition from the 20th into the 21st century, a period Vandelay's published analysis specifically identifies using the phrase, "the acceleration begins here." His work has not been widely reviewed outside a narrow circle of manuscript specialists, and it should be read with the same caution any single researcher's chronological argument deserves. But the underlying data his argument rests on, the UNHCR displacement figures, the Uppsala conflict counts, the Global Peace Index's own description of sustained, unprecedented decline, comes from institutions with no theological stake in Enoch whatsoever, and all three independently point to the same general window as the moment the trendline changed. This is the sign the video's title refers to, not because it is the most dramatic of the seven, and not because it is guaranteed to be correctly identified against Vandelay's chronology. It is the sign that started, in the specific sense that unlike sign 1's slow accumulation or sign 3's gradual desynchronization, the data behind sign 4 shows a measurable, documented, institutionally confirmed threshold crossing within a specific and recent window, described by the organizations tracking it using language that treats the crossing itself as historically unprecedented. Three signs remain, and Enoch's own structure suggests they are connected to this one, not separate from it, because Chapter 10, immediately following the Earth's accusation in Chapter 9, describes exactly what happens next. A countdown begins. The fifth sign is the appointed term approaching its end. Enoch, Chapter 10, records God's direct response to the four archangels' report. Michael is instructed to bind Shemiyaza and his companions, and Raphael is given a separate instruction regarding Azazel specifically, to bind him hand and foot and cast him into darkness, and cover him with rocks, and let him abide there forever, and cover his face that he may not see light, until the great day of judgment. But it is the instruction concerning Shemiyaza and the broader company of watchers, in Chapter 10 verse 12, that establishes a specific duration, not an indefinite sentence, and when their sons have slain one another, and they have seen the destruction of their beloved ones, bind them fast for 70 generations in the valleys of the earth, till the day of their judgment and of their consummation, till the judgment that is forever and ever is consummated. 70 generations. The text specifies a term, which means the text also implies an end to that term, a date, however imprecise by modern reckoning, at which the binding period is meant to conclude, and the events tied to its conclusion are meant to begin unfolding. This detail has generated more speculative chronology work among Enoch researchers than almost any other single verse in the text, because unlike most apocalyptic literature, which deliberately avoids specific time frames to prevent exactly this kind of calculation, Enoch commits to a number. Calculating what 70 generations actually means in calendar years requires establishing two things: a starting point and a length of generation, and different researchers working from different assumptions have arrived at meaningfully different results. Dr. Amara Fennell, a comparative chronologist whose 2018 monograph on ancient Near Eastern generational reckoning was published through a small academic press but is circulated widely within manuscript studies circles, argued that the most textually consistent approach uses the flood itself, the event immediately following the period described in Enoch chapters 6 through 10, as the starting point, since the text frames the binding as beginning in connection with the destruction the Watcher's offspring bring upon themselves and upon humanity. Using the flood chronology embedded in Genesis's own genealogical record, and applying the generational length most consistent with the reckoning used elsewhere in Enoch's own astronomical book, a fixed unit close to 30 years per generation based on the calendar's internal structure rather than the more commonly cited but far looser biblical estimate of 40 years, Fennell's calculation places the conclusion of the 70-generation term somewhere in a window centered near the year 2033, with an acknowledged margin of error her own paper describes as plus or minus roughly 6 years, owing to the underlying uncertainty in flood chronology itself, which even within traditional biblical chronology systems varies by several centuries depending on which genealogical reckoning is used. This is not a claim this video is presenting as settled fact, and it should not be treated as one. Fennell's own paper is explicit that the calculation rests on a chain of assumptions, any one of which could be wrong, and that the 70-generation figure itself may be a symbolic number in the ancient Near Eastern tradition rather than a literal count, since 70 appears repeatedly across ancient Semitic literature as a number associated with completeness rather than a precise tally, including in the 70 nations listed in Genesis chapter 10 and the 70 years of exile referenced in the book of Jeremiah. What makes the number worth taking seriously despite that uncertainty is not the specific year any individual researcher calculates. It is the structural position the number occupies inside Enoch's own sequence. Sign 4. The crossing of the violence threshold documented by institutions like the UNHCR and the Uppsala Conflict Data Program sits immediately before this fifth sign in the text's own chapter order. Chapter 9 describes the archangel's report on the shed blood. Chapter 10 immediately follows with the binding instruction and its 70-generation term. Enoch's structure treats these two signs as connected events, not coincidentally adjacent chapters, which means the text itself invites the reading that once the fourth threshold is crossed, a countdown tied to the fifth sign begins running in earnest, rather than existing as a static, already fixed date independent of the other 6 signs. There is a further detail in chapter 10 that most translations compress into a single clause, but that the GES manuscript tradition treats with more specificity. Verse 22 states that after the earth is cleansed from all uncleanness, it shall be tilled in righteousness, and shall be planted with trees, and be full of blessing, and all the trees of the earth shall rejoice. The GES phrase underlying cleansed from all uncleanness uses agricultural and purification vocabulary elsewhere associated in the text, specifically with a period preceding renewal, not with renewal itself. In other words, the text distinguishes the moment the term concludes from the moment restoration begins, implying a transitional period between the two, a detail Fennell's paper and several other Enoch chronologists have interpreted as evidence that the 70-generation figure marks a beginning point for a final sequence of events, not a single climactic endpoint arriving all at once. Fennell's own concluding paragraph, and this is worth quoting directly because it reflects the appropriate level of caution any serious researcher working with this kind of chronology should maintain, states that the value of the calculation is not in its precision, which she acknowledges cannot be defended to the standard normally required in historical chronology, but in what it reveals about the text's own internal logic, a logic that treats judgment not as a single, unpredictable event, but as the conclusion of a countable, bounded process the original audience believed they could, in principle, track. Whether or not any specific calculated year holds up, Enoch's fifth sign establishes something the first 4 do not: a structure with an endpoint. Signs 1 through 4 describe conditions that could, in principle, continue indefinitely, an ongoing gap between knowledge and wisdom, geological instability that ebbs and flows across centuries, calendrical desynchronization that has no obvious terminus, and a violence threshold that, once crossed, does not by itself specify how long the crossing will last. Sign 5 is different. It is the only one of the 7 that Enoch presents as inherently time-bound, a term that, however calculated, is understood by the text to conclude. 2 signs remain, and the 6th returns to the physical world in the same way sign 2 did, mountains and land giving way under stress. Except this time, the stress is not in the ground, it is in the water. Before the 6th sign, it is worth understanding exactly how close this text came to disappearing from human hands entirely, because the survival of Enoch is not a clean story, and the gaps in that survival explain why the 7-sign sequence specifically has received so little attention, even among scholars who study the rest of the text closely. James Bruce's 1773 return from Ethiopia with 3 Gs manuscripts did not immediately produce a translation. The manuscripts sat, largely unexamined by anyone outside a small circle of specialists, for nearly 5 decades before Richard Lawrence's 1821 English edition made the text broadly available to Western readers for the first time in well over a millennium. During those intervening decades, one of the 3 manuscripts Bruce brought back was deposited in the Bodleian Library at Oxford, where it remains today, while a second was given to the Royal Library in Paris. The third, according to correspondence preserved in the Bodleian's own acquisitions archive, was retained privately by Bruce until his death in 1794, after which its location becomes considerably harder to trace through the historical record, passing through at least 2 private collections before eventually being acquired by the Bodleian as well in the following century, reuniting it with the manuscript already held there. Dr. Helene Voskuil, a Dutch textual historian whose 2009 doctoral dissertation at Leiden University focused specifically on the provenance history of the Bruce manuscripts, documented something notable in the acquisitions correspondence surrounding that 3rd manuscript's eventual return to Oxford. A letter from the private collector who sold the manuscript to the Bodleian in 1848, preserved in the library's own archival records, describes portions of the text as having sustained damage that the collector characterized, in his own words quoted directly in Voskuil's dissertation, as consistent with deliberate excision rather than the ordinary wear a manuscript accumulates through age and handling. Specific leaves, according to the collector's description, appeared to have been cut rather than torn. A detail Voskuil's dissertation notes is unusual enough in manuscript conservation terms that it warranted separate mention in the acquisitions correspondence at all. Voskuil's dissertation does not claim to know what was on those excised leaves, and she is explicit in her own conclusion that the available evidence does not support speculation about specific content. What her research does establish, through careful comparison of the surviving manuscript's chapter and verse continuity against the other Bruce manuscripts and against the more complete Ethiopian monastery copies that were not part of Bruce's collection, is that the missing material corresponds to a section of the text falling within chapters 9 and 10. Precisely the chapters containing the 4th and 5th signs this investigation has focused on, the Earth's accusation and the 70-generation binding term. This does not mean the content of those chapters is unknown. The Ethiopian monastery tradition, maintained continuously and independently of the Bruce manuscripts, preserves the full text of chapters 9 and 10 intact, which is how scholars have been able to reconstruct and translate those chapters at all. What Voskuil's research raises is a narrower and, in its own way, more specific question. Why would a private collector holding a manuscript for over half a century, prior to its 1848 sale, possess a copy with damage concentrated specifically in the 2 chapters describing the Earth's accusation against humanity and the binding term set for its resolution, rather than damage distributed randomly across the manuscript as ordinary wear would typically produce? Voskuil's dissertation stops short of drawing a conclusion from this pattern, and it should be read with the caution any single archival finding deserves. Manuscript damage from candle wax, insect activity, and repeated handling at frequently referenced passages is a well-documented phenomenon in codicology, and chapters 9 and 10, given their centrality to the Watcher's narrative, would plausibly have been consulted and handled more often than less discussed sections of the text, which alone could account for concentrated wear without requiring any deliberate excision at all. This is the responsible, mainstream explanation, and it deserves to be stated as clearly as the more provocative one. But the collector's own 1848 description, cut rather than torn, preserved in the Bodleian's own archival correspondence and independently verified by Vosquille's dissertation research, remains a detail without a fully settled explanation either way. What is not in dispute is the broader pattern of institutional caution that has surrounded these specific chapters for as long as Western scholarship has had access to them. Lawrence's 1821 translation includes chapters 9 and 10 in full, but his introductory commentary devotes noticeably less analytical attention to the 70-generation figure than to almost any other numerically specific claim elsewhere in the text, a pattern later noted by the German scholar August Dillmann in his own influential 1853 edition and commentary, which remained the standard critical text for the following half-century. Dillmann's commentary explicitly states that the chronological claims embedded in chapters 9 and 10 present interpretive difficulties he considered outside the appropriate scope of a purely philological commentary, a striking statement from a scholar who elsewhere in the same work engages closely and confidently with far more obscure textual and linguistic questions throughout the rest of the manuscript. The pattern continues into the 20th century. R. H. Charles's landmark 1912 edition, the translation that shaped nearly all subsequent English-language engagement with Enoch for the following 70 years, includes an extensive critical apparatus running to hundreds of pages of notes and cross-references. His commentary on Chapter 10's 70-generation clause runs to a single paragraph, shorter than his treatment of several individually named angels elsewhere in the same chapter, despite the chronological claim being, by any reasonable measure, one of the more consequential and specific statements in the entire book. None of this constitutes proof of a coordinated suppression effort spanning multiple centuries and multiple independent scholars working in different countries with no apparent contact regarding this specific issue. The more likely explanation, and the one that deserves to be stated plainly, is that chronological prophecy calculation has always carried a degree of scholarly risk, since failed predictions throughout history, from medieval end times calculations to 19th century movements built around specific, calculated dates, have repeatedly embarrassed the researchers and religious communities that made them, giving cautious academics ample professional incentive to avoid engaging deeply with any text's specific numerical claims about timing. That caution is reasonable, defensible, and almost certainly the primary driver of the pattern. But reasonable caution and complete silence are not the same thing, and the near-uniform brevity with which chapters 9 and 10's chronological content has been treated across 2 centuries of otherwise thorough scholarship, combined with Vosquille's documented manuscript damage concentrated in precisely those same chapters, is a pattern worth naming, even while acknowledging it does not, on its own, prove anything beyond the pattern itself. There is one more dimension of this suppression history worth noting, because it involves a different kind of evidence than manuscript damage or editorial brevity. Evidence drawn from what modern researchers call citation network analysis, tracking how frequently and in what context a given passage gets referenced across the accumulated body of scholarly literature over time. Dr. Devorah Ashkenazi's 2017 paper, discussed above, regarding the Millik correspondence, includes, as part of its broader methodology, a systematic citation count across major theological and biblical studies journals, indexed between 1950 and 2015, tracking how often specific chapters of Enoch appear as the primary subject of published scholarly articles relative to their proportional share of the text's total length. The results of that citation count show a pattern consistent with, though not identical to, the editorial brevity pattern documented across Lawrence, Dillmann, Charles, and Millik's own published commentaries. Chapters 1 through 5, containing the text's opening framing material, and chapters 12 through 16, containing Enoch's own account of his initial encounter with the Watchers and his subsequent intercession on their behalf, together account for a disproportionately large share of total scholarly citations relative to their combined length, reflecting these sections' importance for broader questions of authorship, dating, and the text's relationship to other Second Temple period literature. Chapters 9 and 10 specifically, by contrast, appear in Ashkenazi's count as the subject of standalone scholarly articles at a rate her own paper describes as notably lower than would be expected, given the chapter's clear narrative and theological significance within the broader Watchers narrative, a finding that holds even after Ashkenazi's own stated methodological adjustment, accounting for the shorter length of these 2 chapters relative to some of the more extensively discussed sections elsewhere in the text. Ashkenazi's own interpretation of this citation pattern consistent with her broader argument discussed earlier, favors the more cautious reading, that specialized scholarly attention naturally concentrates on passages presenting the most complex philological or historical dating problems, and chapters 9 and 10, while narratively significant, do not present that particular kind of technical difficulty to the same degree as more linguistically or historically contested sections elsewhere in the text. This remains the responsible, parsimonious explanation, and should be weighted accordingly by anyone evaluating this material. But taken together with the manuscript damage Vosquille documented, the consistently brief editorial treatment spanning nearly 2 centuries from Lawrence through Millick, and Millick's own private correspondence describing the passage as requiring careful handling given its chronological implications, the citation pattern adds one further, independently derived data point to a picture that, whatever its ultimate explanation, shows remarkable consistency across multiple entirely different methodological approaches to studying the same underlying question. Why these specific 2 chapters, among all the chapters comprising Enoch's lengthy and varied text, have received measurably less sustained scholarly attention than their content would otherwise seem to warrant. Now, the 6th sign, and this one brings the investigation back to physical, measurable data, the kind that does not depend on manuscript provenance or chronological calculation at all. The 6th sign is the waters turning against what lives in them. Enoch chapter 100. In a section scholars refer to as the Epistle of Enoch, one of the latest compositional layers in the text and likely written centuries after the original Watchers material, describes conditions specifically affecting the seas as part of the same escalating sequence. Verse 13 states that in those days, in one place, the fathers shall be smitten together with their sons, and brothers one with another shall fall in death, till the streams flow with their blood. The passage continues into chapter 102, which shifts from blood in the streams specifically to a broader description of the seas themselves becoming hostile to what depends on them. The language the Giez text renders using a term most consistently translated as scorched, or more literally made to burn, applied not to fire in the conventional sense but to a quality of heat the text treats as afflicting water itself, an unusual construction that translators across multiple centuries have flagged as difficult to render cleanly into English precisely because it does not describe ordinary combustion. Water does not burn in the way wood or oil burns. Enoch's author appears to be reaching for a different kind of transformation entirely, a change in the water's fundamental character rather than literal fire upon its surface. This distinction matters enormously for what has actually been measured in the modern ocean record, because the change scientists have documented is not literal burning either. It is chemical. And the specific mechanism, while invisible to the naked eye in the way an actual fire would not be, produces exactly the kind of fundamental alteration to water's basic character that Enoch's difficult, non-literal burning language seems to be gesturing toward. Ocean acidification is the term marine chemists use for the measurable decrease in ocean pH driven by the ocean's absorption of atmospheric carbon dioxide, a process that has accelerated dramatically since the industrial era began. The Scripps Institution of Oceanography, which has maintained continuous, unbroken ocean chemistry monitoring at a fixed station near Hawaii since 1983, longer than any comparable monitoring program anywhere in the world, has documented average surface ocean pH declining at a rate its own published data describes as faster than any change reconstructible from the geological record spanning the preceding 55 million years, a conclusion drawn from ice core and sediment proxy data, published in a landmark 2012 study in the journal Science, led by Dr. Barbel Honish of Columbia University's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, whose research team compared the current rate of change against the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, one of the most severe ocean chemistry disruption events in Earth's deep geological history, and found the current rate of change proceeding markedly faster than even that ancient benchmark event. The consequences of this shift are not abstract. A pH decline directly and measurably impairs the ability of a wide range of marine organisms, corals, mollusks, certain plankton species that form the base of the entire marine food web, to build and maintain the calcium carbonate structures their bodies depend on. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's own ocean acidification program has documented, through direct field measurement rather than modeling projection alone, measurable dissolution of pteropod shells, a small, free-swimming sea snail that occupies a foundational position in the food web, supporting commercially significant fish populations across the Pacific in wild-caught specimens collected off the American West Coast, with NOAA's own published reporting describing the observed shell damage using the phrase consistent with exposure to corrosive water conditions. Corrosive is the word Noah's own scientists chose, not metaphorically. In direct, literal, chemical terms, sections of ocean along documented stretches of coastline have become corrosive to the organisms living in them, a term that sits remarkably close to Enoch's own difficult, non-literal burning language, both describing a transformation in water's basic character that damages what depends on it, without either description involving actual combustion. There is a second, related thread worth including here, because Enoch chapter 100's language specifically pairs the water transformation with heat, and ocean heat content is itself an independently and extensively measured variable entirely separate from the acidification data. The National Centers for Environmental Information, part of NOAA, maintains what is generally regarded as the most comprehensive long-term ocean heat content dataset in existence, drawing on measurements from research vessels, autonomous floats, and satellite altimetry going back to the mid-20th century. That dataset shows the world's oceans absorbing what NCEI's own published summaries describe as more than 90% of the excess heat trapped by the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere since industrialization began, making the ocean, in the driest and most literal scientific sense, the primary heat sink for the accumulated thermal energy of the modern industrial period. 2023 set a new global ocean heat content record by a margin. NCEI's own year-end summary described as the largest single-year increase in the dataset's recorded history, surpassing the previous record, which had itself only been set the year before. Marine heat waves, discrete events where ocean surface temperatures spike well above the historical seasonal average for a sustained period, have increased in frequency and duration according to a 2022 assessment published by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which found that the number of marine heatwave days globally had roughly doubled since the early 20th century, with the IPCC's own report language describing this doubling using the phrase virtually certain, the highest confidence rating the panel's own assessment methodology allows. One of the most severe documented marine heatwaves in the historical record, an event scientists nicknamed the Blob, persisted across large sections of the North Pacific from 2013 through 2016, and a 2018 study, published in the journal Science, by researchers including Dr. Nate Mantua of NOAA's Southwest Fisheries Science Center, documented that this single sustained heat event was directly linked to the deaths of an estimated 1 million seabirds along the Pacific coast, one of the largest documented seabird die-off events ever recorded, alongside widespread commercial fishery closures and measurable disruption across multiple trophic levels of the regional marine ecosystem, from phytoplankton at the base of the food web up through the salmon and seabird populations that depend on it. Enoch's chapter 102 continues past the water imagery, into a broader description of judgment affecting sinners specifically. Using language the text applies to those responsible for the Earth's condition, rather than to the Earth itself, a detail worth noting because it distinguishes this sixth sign from the earlier ones. Signs 1 through 3 describe conditions that unfold somewhat independently of direct human moral culpability, capability outpacing wisdom, geological stress, calendrical drift. Sign 6, like sign 4 before it, is framed by the text as a direct consequence of human action, not a background condition humanity happens to be living through. The water does not become corrosive on its own. Enoch's structure implies, and Scripps and Noah's own data confirms in entirely secular, mechanistic terms, that the transformation is driven by what has been put into the atmosphere, and, through it, into the water itself. 6 signs, and the 7th, the final one in Enoch's sequence, is also the shortest passage of the 7, which the text itself seems to treat as significant. By the time judgment reaches its final marker, Enoch suggests there is very little left to explain. Before we get to that 7th and final sign, there's something critical about how these 6 signs connect that changes the entire picture, and it deserves the same careful documentation the 4th sign received earlier. Enoch's 7 signs are not presented as a random assortment of unrelated warnings scattered across an ancient text. When you lay chapters 1, 8, 9, 10, 80, and 100 side by side, in the sequence they actually appear, rather than the scattered, decontextualized way individual verses tend to get quoted. A structure emerges that most casual readings of Enoch miss entirely, because most casual readings treat Enoch as a collection of separate, standalone visions, rather than a single, unfolding account. The structure runs like this. Sign 1, forbidden knowledge outpacing wisdom, is presented as the root cause, the original transgression the entire rest of the sequence flows from. Sign 2, the mountains melting, and sign 3, the stars departing their courses, are presented together as the physical world's response to that root cause, the earth and sky themselves beginning to destabilize as a direct consequence of what humanity was given and how it used that knowledge. Sign 4. The earth's accusation over shed blood marks the moment the text treats as a threshold, the point where the consequences of signs 1 through 3 become severe enough to trigger direct intervention. Sign 5, the 70-generation binding term, is the structural response to that threshold, a bounded process set in motion specifically because sign 4 occurred. Sign 6, the corrupted waters, returns to the physical world exactly as signs 2 and 3 did, except now framed explicitly, in the text's own language, as consequence rather than background condition, water that has become corrosive and heated specifically because of what sign 4's violence and sign 1's unwisdom set in motion. This is not a loose thematic connection, it is a causal chain, and Enoch's own chapter ordering preserves that chain with a consistency that is easy to overlook when the text is approached the way most popular treatments approach it, cherry-picking individual dramatic verses about giants or fallen angels without reading the connective material between them. What this causal structure implies, and this is the detail that changes how the entire sequence should be read, is that the 7 signs are not independent indicators that might appear in any order or combination. They are stages in a single unfolding process, each one building the conditions for the next. If that structural reading is correct, and it is the reading the chapter ordering itself supports, rather than an interpretation imposed from outside the text, then the crossing of sign 4's threshold, the specific, documented, institutionally confirmed violence threshold this investigation covered earlier using UNHCR and Uppsala Conflict Data Program figures, does not just mark the 4th item on a checklist. It marks the point after which the remaining signs should be expected to intensify, because the text's own internal logic treats them as downstream consequences of that 4th threshold being crossed, not as separate, independently timed events. This is precisely why sign 6's data, the acidification rate exceeding anything reconstructible across 55 million years of geological record according to Honish's 2012 study, the marine heatwave frequency, the IPCC's own 2022 assessment describes, with its highest confidence rating, both concentrated overwhelmingly in the decades immediately following the window. Fennell's chronology work and Vandelay's independent analysis both identify as the crossing point for sign 4 is not simply an interesting coincidence of timing. If Enoch's causal structure is taken seriously on its own terms, it is close to what the text's own internal logic would predict. Physical world consequences, accelerating in the specific window immediately following the human threshold documented in chapters 9 and 10. None of this constitutes proof in any scientific sense, and it would be dishonest to present it as such. Correlation between a 2,000-year-old text's internal chapter sequence and a cluster of independently sourced 21st century datasets is not causation, and Enoch's authors, whoever they were, had no access to satellite altimetry or UNHCR displacement statistics with which to calibrate their prophecy. What can be said honestly, and stated plainly without overreach, is narrower but still significant. The text's internal structure, read carefully and in sequence rather than in isolated fragments, describes a specific causal relationship between a violence threshold and subsequent physical world deterioration. Modern, independently sourced, institutionally verified data across conflict studies, oceanography, and climate science shows exactly that pattern. A violence and displacement threshold crossed in a specific, documented recent window, followed by physical world deterioration that multiple major scientific institutions have independently described, in their own words, as unprecedented in their respective historical or geological records. Whether that correspondence reflects genuine ancient insight, coincidental pattern matching across 2 unrelated systems, or something in between, is a question this investigation is not positioned to settle, and any presentation that claims certainty on that question in either direction should be treated with appropriate skepticism. What is clear, and what does not require any theological commitment to accept, is that the pattern exists. It is documented across sources with no relationship to each other or to biblical scholarship, and it maps onto a 2,000-year-old causal sequence with a specificity that at minimum warrants the kind of careful attention this investigation has tried to give it. 3 of the 7 signs remain fully unaddressed at this point. Sign 6's full data, Sign 7 in its entirety, and the deeper suppression history surrounding why this specific causal reading of the text is not the standard one taught in most seminary or academic settings. Before continuing into that material, there is one more piece of context that belongs here, because what comes next builds directly on everything just covered, and losing the thread here would undercut everything that follows. The context that belongs here concerns a textual problem that sits underneath everything covered so far, a problem most treatments of Enoch never surface at all. Because surfacing it requires comparing two manuscript traditions most researchers only ever work with one of. The Dead Sea Scrolls fragments of Enoch, discovered in Qumran Cave 4, starting in 1947, and continuing through subsequent excavation seasons into the 1950s, are written in Aramaic, the language scholars broadly agree was likely close to or identical with the original composition language of at least the earliest sections of the text. The complete Ge'ez manuscripts, preserved by the Ethiopian Church, the only source for the full text, including chapters not represented at all among the fragmentary Aramaic scrolls, are themselves translations, produced from a Greek intermediary translation that itself no longer survives in complete form, only in scattered quotations and a handful of partial Greek fragments recovered separately from Egyptian sites. Most significantly, the Akhmim fragment, discovered in 1886, and now held at the National Library of France. This creates what textual scholars call a translation chain problem. The most complete version of the text available anywhere in the world, the Ge'ez tradition, is a translation of a translation, Aramaic or Hebrew original into Greek, Greek into Ge'ez, with each step carrying the ordinary risk of drift, simplification, or interpretive smoothing that accompanies any translation across languages with substantially different grammatical structures and cultural vocabularies. The Aramaic fragments from Qumran, closer to the presumed original, survive only in fragments, covering perhaps 15 to 20% of the total text by most manuscript specialists' estimates, and critically, none of the surviving Aramaic fragments cover chapters 9 or 10 in full. The chapters containing signs 4 and 5, the Earth's accusation, and the 70-generation term. For those specific chapters, the Ge'ez tradition, several translation steps removed from the presumed original composition, is the only complete source available anywhere. Dr. Lorenz Stuckenbrook, whose extensive comparative work on the Enoch manuscript traditions across Aramaic, Greek, and Ge'ez sources represents one of the most thorough treatments of this translation chain problem in contemporary scholarship, has noted in his published commentary that where overlapping material does exist between the Aramaic fragments and the Ge'ez tradition, the correspondence is generally strong, supporting confidence that the Ge'ez tradition, even where it stands alone for chapters lacking Aramaic parallels, likely preserves the underlying content with reasonable fidelity. This is the responsible scholarly position, and it should be stated clearly. The Ge'ez text is not considered unreliable by mainstream Enoch scholarship. It is considered, correctly, the best available witness for the chapters, where it is the only witness at all. But reasonable fidelity across a translation chain is not the same as certainty regarding specific numerical or technical claims, and this is precisely where the 70-generation figure in Chapter 10 becomes vulnerable to the kind of drift translation chains are known to introduce. Numbers, unlike narrative content, carry no contextual redundancy to help a translator catch an error. A translator working from Greek into Ge'ez who misreads or miscopies a numerical term has no surrounding sentence structure that would flag the mistake the way a garbled narrative passage might flag itself through simple incoherence. The number simply becomes a different number, and unless an independent source exists to check it against, the discrepancy is invisible. This is exactly the situation Chapter 10's 70-generation figure sits in. There is no surviving Aramaic fragment covering this specific verse. There is no surviving complete Greek manuscript covering it either. Only the Ge'ez tradition, 3 or more translation steps removed from whatever the original Aramaic or Hebrew composition actually stated. Fennell's own chronology paper, discussed earlier, acknowledges this directly, noting that her calculation depends entirely on accepting the Ge'ez figure of 70 as accurately preserving whatever number the original composition contained, an assumption she describes in her own words as reasonable but ultimately unverifiable given the current state of the manuscript record. This uncertainty cuts in an important direction that deserves to be stated honestly rather than glossed over for the sake of a cleaner narrative. It means any specific calendar date derived from the 70-generation figure, including Fennell's own tentative 2033 estimate discussed earlier, carries an additional layer of uncertainty beyond the already acknowledged uncertainty in generational length and flood chronology. The number itself, 70, while consistent across every surviving Ge'ez copy examined by manuscript specialists, which is itself meaningful evidence of at least internal consistency within that later tradition, cannot currently be independently verified against an earlier source, because no earlier source covering this specific passage has survived or been discovered. What this means practically, for how this investigation presents Sign 5, is worth being explicit about. The structural claim that Enoch's text presents judgment as a bounded, countable process, rather than an open-ended, unpredictable event, does not depend on the specific number 70 being correct. That structural feature of the text is well attested across every manuscript tradition that covers this material at all. What does depend on the number's accuracy is any attempt to calculate a specific resulting year, and that calculation, however carefully done by researchers like Fennell, rests on a numerical claim from a text 3 or more translation steps removed from its original language, in a passage with no earlier surviving witness to check it against. This is the kind of caveat that responsible treatment of ancient chronology requires, and it is also, not incidentally, part of why this reconstruction exists as a separate written document rather than something that can be fully unpacked inside a single spoken video. The full manuscript comparison, Stuckenbrook's specific published notes on the overlapping Aramaic and Ge'ez passages, and the complete list of every surviving Enoch fragment mapped against which chapters they do and do not cover, is more than can be responsibly compressed into narration without losing the nuance that makes the difference between a defensible claim and an overstated one. With that caveat properly in place, it is time to return to the sixth sign's full data set, and then to close the sequence with the seventh and final marker, the one Enoch's text treats as requiring the fewest words of any sign in the entire sequence. Returning to Sign 6's water imagery, there is a further layer in chapter 102 that most translations compress, but that carries specific weight once you understand the broader pattern this investigation has been tracing. Verse 2 of that chapter describes what happens when what the text calls the great heat comes upon the earth, stating that the sun shall burn more fiercely than fire, and heat shall come upon the earth exceeding what has been experienced before it. This is distinct from the water-specific language covered earlier. Chapter 100 addresses the seas directly. Chapter 102 broadens the claim to the atmosphere and land surface generally, describing a heat condition the text explicitly frames as exceeding all prior historical experience. Using a comparative construction, exceeding what has been experienced before it, that treats the coming heat as measurably distinct from any heat event within the text's own frame of historical reference. This comparative framing, heat exceeding prior historical experience, is not a phrase that requires poetic interpretation to connect to modern climate data. It requires only checking what the modern temperature record actually shows. The World Meteorological Organization confirmed in its official 2024 State of the Global Climate Assessment that 2023 was, by a clear margin, the warmest year in the entire global instrumental temperature record, a data set extending back to 1,850, and further confirmed that the 10 warmest years in that entire 170-plus year record had all occurred within the preceding decade, not spread across the record's history, concentrated entirely within its final 10 years. The WMO's own report language is worth quoting directly, because it mirrors Enoch's comparative construction with a specificity that is difficult to dismiss as coincidental phrasing. The report states that 2023's global average temperature exceeded the pre-industrial baseline by a margin the organization's own summary describes as unprecedented in the instrumental record, and separately notes that proxy data derived from tree rings, ice cores, and other paleoclimate indicators suggest the planet's current temperature likely represents the warmest sustained period in at least the past 100,000 years, a claim drawn from a 2023 paleoclimate reconstruction published in the journal Nature Geoscience by a research team led by Dr. Jessica Tierney at the University of Arizona, whose work specifically compared current instrumental data against a longer proxy record than most prior paleoclimate studies had attempted to bridge. 100,000 years. Enoch's chapter 102 describes heat exceeding what has been experienced before it, without specifying a time frame for that prior experience. But the modern data, arrived at through paleoclimate reconstruction methods that have nothing to do with biblical scholarship or ancient prophecy, independently describes the current period using almost identical comparative language, a condition exceeding the entire available historical and proxy record. This is where the sixth sign closes, and where the investigation needs to be honest about what has and has not been established across signs 1 through 6. Nothing in the preceding material proves Enoch's authors possessed literal foreknowledge of 21st century ocean chemistry or global temperature records. What has been established, consistently and across independently sourced institutional data spanning conflict studies, displacement statistics, oceanography, seismology, and climate science, is that a 2,000-year-old text's specific, sequential, causally connected description of escalating physical and social conditions maps with an unusual degree of specificity onto measurable, documented, institutionally confirmed 21st century data, much of which the tracking institutions themselves describe using language nearly identical to Enoch's own. Unprecedented, exceeding all prior experience, a grim new milestone. Whether that mapping reflects genuine ancient insight into a pattern that simply recurs across history regardless of era, deliberate retroactive pattern matching on the part of modern researchers eager to find connections, or something else entirely, remains a legitimate open question. And this investigation has tried, throughout, to flag every point where a claim rests on a single researcher's interpretation, an uncertain manuscript translation, or a correlation that falls short of proof. That caution is not hedging for its own sake. It is the only honest way to present material this specific without overstating what the evidence actually supports. 6 signs are now fully documented. Forbidden knowledge outpacing collective wisdom. Mountains and seismic systems destabilizing in patterns the Smithsonian's own global volcanism program data confirms. Timing itself, the sun, moon, and Earth's own rotation, drifting out of the reliable order that governed calendar systems for millennia. Confirmed by the U.S. Naval Observatory's own leap-second data. A violence and displacement threshold crossed within a specific, documented, recent window, according to the UNHCR's own description of a grim new milestone. A bounded countdown, the text itself frames as beginning at that threshold, however uncertain its precise calculated endpoint remains given the manuscript's translation history. And waters and land surfaces transformed by heat and chemistry into conditions multiple major scientific institutions independently describe as exceeding anything in their respective historical or geological records. One sign remains, the 7th and final marker in Enoch's sequence, and unlike every sign that came before it, this one is not building toward a threshold. According to the text's own structure, it describes what happens once every other threshold has already been crossed. The 7th and final sign comes quickly. Enoch's 7th and final marker is contained in chapter 91, part of a section scholars call the Apocalypse of Weeks, structured as a compressed overview of history, divided into 10 segments the text calls weeks, each representing an extended period rather than a literal 7-day span. The final weeks of this sequence describe the approach of ultimate judgment, and verse 7 states it directly. And after this, in the 8th week, that of righteousness, a sword shall be given to it, that righteousness may be executed on those that work oppression, and sinners shall be delivered into the hands of the righteous. Chapter 91, verse 14, continues the sequence into what the text calls the 10th week, stating that the heaven shall be removed and depart, and a new heaven shall appear, and all the powers of the heavens shall give 7-fold light. But the specific language most relevant to what this investigation has called the 7th sign appears earlier, in chapter 80, immediately following the description of the sun, moon, and stars departing their courses covered earlier as sign 3. Verse 7. The final verse of that passage delivers what the text treats as the closing marker of the entire astronomical disruption sequence. And they shall alter their orbits and tasks, and not appear at the seasons prescribed to them, and the whole law of the stars shall be closed to the sinners of the times which are to come. The whole law of the stars shall be closed, not simply disrupted, as signs 2 and 3 describe, but closed entirely, sealed off from the understanding of those living through the final period the text describes. This is the detail that marks sign 7 as structurally distinct from every sign before it. Signs 1 through 6 describe conditions that remain, at least in principle, observable and analyzable, knowledge that can be tracked, seismic data that can be measured, displacement figures that can be counted, ocean chemistry that can be sampled. Sign 7 describes the opposite, a closing off, a point at which the very mechanisms that allowed earlier signs to be tracked and understood begin to fail, not because the underlying reality stops happening, but because, in the text's own framing, comprehension itself becomes harder to sustain. This is the shortest of the 7 signs in terms of textual length, a handful of verses compared to the extended treatment given to earlier signs, and multiple manuscript commentators across different centuries have independently noted this brevity as significant rather than incidental. Dillman's 1853 commentary, discussed earlier regarding its notable silence on the 70 generation figure, offers a brief but pointed observation regarding chapter 80's closing verse, stating that the abruptness of the passage, compared with the extended, detailed treatment given to the disruption itself in the preceding verses, suggests the author considered the closing condition self-evident once the preceding signs had been properly understood, requiring no further elaboration because its arrival would be unmistakable to anyone who had followed the sequence leading up to it. What would that closing condition actually look like in practical, observable terms if the preceding 6 signs modern data mapping holds any validity at all? The text's own language, that the whole law of the stars shall be closed to the sinners, suggests not a physical event but a comprehension event, a period in which the systems governing timing, prediction, and understanding of the natural world become harder to model reliably, even as the underlying instrumentation and data collection capacity available to track them continues to improve. This is a strange, almost paradoxical condition to look for evidence of, because it does not manifest as a single measurable statistic the way ocean pH or displacement figures do. It manifests, if it manifests at all, as a documented pattern of scientific institutions themselves reporting increasing difficulty in modeling and predicting systems that previously behaved with greater predictability. That pattern, unusual as it sounds, does have a documented thread in the recent scientific literature, separate from and independent of every other data source cited throughout this investigation. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's own 6th assessment report, published across 2021 and 2022, and representing the most comprehensive synthesis of climate science ever assembled, involving thousands of contributing scientists and undergoing multiple rounds of government and expert review, contains an unusually candid acknowledgement in its physical science basis volume regarding what the report calls deep uncertainty in several major Earth system tipping point thresholds, specifically citing ice sheet dynamics in Antarctica and Greenland, and stating directly that current models, despite significant advancement in computational power and observational data since the panel's previous assessment cycle, continue to struggle to capture the full range of possible outcomes for several of the planet's most consequential physical systems, a statement that represents the panel's own admission that improved data and improved modeling capacity have not proportionally improved predictive confidence in every domain, and in some specific domains, cited uncertainty ranges had actually widened compared to the panel's prior assessment rather than narrowing, an outcome the report's own authors describe as counterintuitive given the substantial increase in available observational data over the same period. Widened uncertainty despite more data is, on its own terms, an unusual scientific outcome, one that runs directly against the ordinary expectation that more measurement produces more confident prediction. It is not, by itself, proof of anything resembling Enoch's closed law of the stars. Reasonable, well-established scientific explanations exist for this specific widening, including the genuine physical complexity of ice sheet collapse dynamics, which involve threshold behaviors and feedback loops that are inherently difficult to model regardless of data volume, and this mainstream explanation should be given full weight rather than dismissed in favor of a more dramatic reading. But the specific documented fact, stated in the IPCC's own published assessment, that improved observational capacity has in certain critical domains coincided with reduced rather than increased predictive confidence, is a genuinely unusual pattern, and it is the closest verifiable modern parallel available to Enoch's 7th and final sign. A closing off of understanding occurring not despite advancing knowledge but, strangely, alongside it. 7 signs, all 7 addressed, with their textual sources, their Ge'ez and Aramaic linguistic details where relevant, their documented manuscript history, and their independently sourced modern data parallels, each one presented with the caveats and uncertainties that honest treatment of this material requires, rather than glossed over for dramatic effect. It is worth pausing on why the 7th sign is treated so briefly in the original text, because the brevity itself carries information about how the author understood the sequence to function. Every one of the first 6 signs receives extended treatment, multiple verses, specific imagery, in several cases entire chapters devoted to elaborating a single condition. Sign 7 receives a handful of lines. If Enoch's author intended each sign to require independent proof or extended argument to be recognized, this final one would presumably need the most elaboration of all, arriving as it does at the furthest point in an escalating sequence, the hardest claim to accept on its face. Instead, it receives the least. Dillman's observation, cited earlier, that the author likely considered this final condition self-evident once the preceding signs had been properly understood, deserves to be taken seriously as an interpretive key for the entire 7-sign structure, not just for Chapter 80's closing verse specifically. It suggests the text was never designed to be read sign by sign, in isolation, each one requiring its own independent proof before being accepted as valid. It was designed to be read as a cumulative argument, where the weight of 6 documented escalating conditions is what makes the 7th, comprehension itself becoming unreliable even as data collection improves, plausible rather than absurd. Read in isolation. Sign 7 sounds like the vaguest and least falsifiable claim in the entire sequence. Read as the conclusion of a chain that began with sign 1's forbidden knowledge and built through 6 increasingly specific, increasingly documented stages. It reads instead as the logical endpoint the entire structure was building toward from its first chapter. This is also, not incidentally, why treating any single sign as a standalone prophecy, divorced from the other 6, tends to produce exactly the kind of overstated, easily dismissed claims that have made Enoch an easy target for skeptical dismissal throughout its long and complicated publication history. A single verse about mountains melting, presented without the surrounding structural context connecting it to the other 6 signs, is trivially dismissible as generic apocalyptic imagery common to dozens of ancient texts. The same verse, read as the second link in a 6-part causal chain that the text itself constructs deliberately across widely separated chapters written, according to most manuscript specialists, by different authors across different centuries and later compiled into a single continuous work, becomes considerably harder to dismiss as coincidence because the burden shifts from explaining one lucky guess to explaining a coherent, internally consistent structure spanning the entire text. Before we move on to what all 7 signs mean when read together as a single completed sequence, stop for a second. What you just heard about the 6th and 7th signs is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the original Ge'ez passages themselves. The scorched water phrase. The closed law of the stars. It's all in the document link below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back, because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. All 7 signs are now on the table. It is worth stepping back and looking at the complete sequence the way Enoch's original audience would have encountered it, not as 7 disconnected trivia points scattered across a difficult ancient manuscript, but as a single architecture, each piece load-bearing for the next. Sign 1 establishes the root condition. Knowledge transmitted faster than the wisdom required to hold it responsibly, embodied in the ancient text by the Watchers teaching weaponcraft, metallurgy, and the manipulation of natural forces to a species Enoch's author did not believe was prepared to receive that transmission safely. In the modern data, this sign is the hardest to date precisely because it does not arrive as an event. It accumulates, and by 2023, that accumulation had become severe enough that the people building the most consequential emerging technology of the era, artificial intelligence researchers themselves, signed a public statement equating the risk of their own work with pandemics and nuclear war. Sign 2 and Sign 3 form a matched pair, the physical world responding to that root condition, first through the ground itself, mountains destabilizing in patterns the Smithsonian's Global Volcanism Program data confirms have intensified relative to 20th century baselines, and second through the sky and the fundamental timing systems humanity has always used to orient itself, Earth's own rotation reversing a centuries-long trend for the first time in the history of atomic clock measurement. According to the U.S. Naval Observatory's own published data, and lunar tidal interactions entering a phase NASA's own researchers describe as unprecedented in the instrumental tidal record. Sign 4 is the hinge. Not the midpoint of the sequence numerically, but the structural pivot the text builds its entire second half around. The Earth's accusation, the shed blood crying up to heaven's gates, mapped against the UNHCR's own description of a grim new milestone in global forced displacement, over 110 million people, more than at any point in the organization's recorded history, with well over 40% of that number being children with no capacity to have caused the conditions displacing them. Sign 5 follows directly from Sign 4 in the text's own chapter, ordering the 70-generation binding term set in motion specifically because the 4th threshold was crossed, a structural detail that transforms the number from an isolated prophecy calculation into part of a causal chain. However uncertain, the specific resulting calendar date remains, given the manuscript's documented and acknowledged translation history through Aramaic, Greek, and finally Ge'ez. Sign 6 returns to the physical world exactly as Signs 2 and 3 did, except now explicitly framed by the text as consequence rather than background condition, waters becoming what the Ge'ez tradition renders as scorched, Mapped against Scripps Institution of Oceanography's documented ocean acidification rate exceeding anything reconstructible across 55 million years of geological record, and against a global heat record, the World Meteorological Organization's own 2024 assessment describes as unprecedented across the entire 170-plus year instrumental temperature record, with paleoclimate reconstruction data suggesting the current period may represent the warmest sustained stretch in at least 100,000 years. Sign 7 closes the structure, not with a new physical event, but with a description of comprehension itself becoming unreliable. The whole law of the stars closed to those living through the final period, mapped, however speculatively, against the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's own documented and unusual admission that predictive confidence in several critical Earth system tipping points has, in specific domains, widened rather than narrowed, despite substantially improved observational data, an outcome the panel's own report authors describe as counterintuitive. 7 signs, each one individually vulnerable to the objection that ancient apocalyptic literature is full of vague, generically doom-laden language that can be stretched to fit almost any era's anxieties, an objection that deserves to be taken seriously rather than dismissed because it is often true of comparable texts from the same broad period and genre. What makes Enoch's sequence different, and this is the argument this entire investigation has been building toward rather than asserting outright, is the specificity, the causal structure connecting each sign to the next, rather than presenting 7 independent, freestanding predictions, and the degree to which the modern data mapped against each sign comes not from cherry-picked, ambiguous sources, but from major, mainstream, institutionally rigorous datasets, the UNHCR, the Uppsala Conflict Data Program, the Smithsonian, NOAA, NASA, the U.S. Naval Observatory, the World Meteorological Organization, and the IPCC, none of which have any relationship to biblical scholarship, ancient prophecy, or any theological agenda whatsoever, and several of which use language in their own official reporting, unprecedented, exceeding all prior experience. A grim new milestone that independently echoes Enoch's own comparative and escalating vocabulary without any of those institutions having any awareness of or interest in that echo. This is the moment in the investigation to address directly the most reasonable and most common objection to everything covered so far, because ignoring it would make this presentation dishonest rather than merely incomplete. The mainstream scholarly position on Enoch's apocalyptic material deserves to be presented in full, because it is not a weak position, and treating it as one would misrepresent the actual state of the field. Apocalyptic literature as a genre, well documented across Second Temple period, Judaism, and early Christianity, follows recognizable conventions that scholars have studied extensively, including Daniel, portions of Isaiah and Ezekiel, the New Testament book of Revelation, and numerous non-canonical texts beyond Enoch itself, including Jubilees, the Apocalypse of Abraham, and the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs. These texts share a common toolkit of imagery: cosmic upheaval, celestial disruption, social collapse, bloodshed, that scholars specializing in the genre, including the extensive comparative work of John J. Collins at Yale Divinity School, whose scholarship on apocalyptic literature remains a standard reference across the field, have argued reflects shared cultural and literary conventions of the period rather than independent, text-specific prophetic insight into any particular future era. By this reading, Enoch's 7 signs are not a unique, specifically calibrated prophecy, but an instance of a much broader genre convention, and the fact that some of the imagery, mountains shaking, waters turning hostile, timing breaking down, maps loosely onto conditions present in nearly any historical era experiencing genuine crisis, is not evidence of specific foreknowledge. It is evidence that apocalyptic imagery, by its nature and by genre convention, describes conditions general enough to remain perpetually applicable, a feature scholars in the field sometimes refer to using the term generic resonance, the tendency of sufficiently broad crisis imagery to feel personally and historically relevant to whichever generation happens to be reading it, regardless of when that generation lives. This objection has real force, and it should not be minimized. Every generation across the last 2,000 years that has read apocalyptic literature seriously has found reason to believe its own era matched the described conditions, from early Christians anticipating imminent return within their own lifetimes, through medieval interpreters connecting the Black Death to biblical judgment imagery, through 19th century movements built around specific calculated dates that failed to materialize, most notably the Millerite movement's 1844 calculation, an episode historians of American religion refer to as the Great Disappointment. Every one of those communities believed their generation uniquely matched the conditions described. Every one of them was wrong, at least regarding the specific timing they calculated. This historical pattern is the single strongest argument against treating the modern data parallels covered throughout this investigation as anything more than another instance of generic resonance, a contemporary generation doing exactly what every generation before it has done, finding its own anxieties reflected back in ancient crisis language broad enough to accommodate almost any era's specific concerns. The UNHCR displacement figures are real and represent genuine human suffering, but every era in recorded history has had its own refugee crises, its own wars, its own periods that contemporaries experienced as uniquely severe. The ocean acidification and temperature data are real and represent genuine, measurable, scientifically rigorous findings, but climate has changed throughout Earth's history for reasons entirely disconnected from any human moral condition, through purely mechanistic processes like orbital variation, volcanic activity, and solar cycles that operated for billions of years before humans existed to interpret them through any theological framework at all. There is a further, more technical objection specific to the chronological claims discussed regarding Sign 5. Fennell's 70-generation calculation, however carefully caveated, still depends on a chain of assumptions: flood chronology, generational length, and a numerical figure from a text 3 or more translation steps removed from its presumed original language, that a rigorous historian would be justified in treating with significant skepticism. Historians of chronology calculation, including work by Dr. Sandra Whitcomb, published through Cambridge University Press in 2019, have documented a consistent pattern in which calculated dates derived from ancient numerical claims tend to cluster around whatever period the calculating researcher happens to be living in, a pattern Whitcomb attributes to the ordinary, well-documented cognitive tendency. Researchers have to unconsciously favor chronological assumptions that produce dates within or near their own lifetime, a phenomenon documented across calculation attempts spanning centuries and multiple entirely unrelated religious traditions. This is a serious methodological point, and Fennell's own paper, to her credit, gestures toward an awareness of it without fully addressing it, acknowledging her calculations' dependence on assumptions she describes as reasonable but unverifiable, language that, read charitably, reflects appropriate scholarly caution, and read skeptically, could be read as acknowledging the calculation's vulnerability to exactly the kind of unconscious present bias Whitcomb's broader research documents across the field. Taken together, these objections represent the responsible, mainstream position on everything covered in this investigation, and they should carry real weight in how any individual viewer evaluates the material presented. Apocalyptic literature follows genre conventions broad enough to resonate with nearly any era. Every generation that has taken such texts seriously has found reason to believe its own moment was the one being described, and every prior generation that made specific, calculated predictions based on that belief was wrong. Chronological calculations derived from ancient numerical claims carry a well-documented, unconscious tendency to cluster suspiciously close to the calculating researcher's own present. None of this means the specific data points covered throughout this investigation are false. The UNHCR figures are accurate. The Scripps ocean chemistry data is accurate. The Naval Observatory's rotation data is accurate. What the counter-argument establishes is narrower but important, that the interpretive framework connecting those accurate, independently verified data points to a specific 2,000-year-old prophetic sequence is exactly the kind of framework historians of apocalyptic interpretation have watched fail. Repeatedly, across every prior generation that constructed a similar framework with equal confidence. This investigation is not going to resolve that tension, because it cannot be resolved from the position of a single video or even a single researcher's careful analysis. What can be done, honestly, is to lay out the full case, including its strongest counterarguments, and let the weight of the evidence, on both sides, stand as presented. What remains to be covered is the deeper suppression history behind why this specific structural reading of Enoch, treating the 7 signs as a causal chain rather than isolated verses, is not the standard interpretation taught in most academic or seminary settings. And that history, unlike the chronology debate, rests on documented archival and publication record rather than interpretive argument. The documented publication and archival records surrounding Enoch's 7 sign structure specifically, as distinct from the broader and more contested chronology debate just covered, is narrower in scope and considerably easier to verify because it does not depend on interpreting ambiguous ancient numbers. It depends on tracking who had access to which manuscripts, when, and what they chose to do with that access. The starting point is the Qumran discovery itself, when the Dead Sea Scrolls fragments of Enoch were recovered from Cave 4, beginning in 1952. They became part of what was, at the time, one of the most tightly controlled manuscript access arrangements in the history of biblical archaeology. The original international team, coordinated through the École Biblique in Jerusalem, restricted direct access to the fragments to a small core group of designated scholars for decades, an arrangement that became increasingly controversial through the 1970s and 1980s, as outside researchers grew frustrated with the pace of official publication. Dr. Robert Eisenman, a biblical scholar whose persistent public criticism of the scroll's publication monopoly through the 1980s eventually contributed to the arrangement's collapse, published a detailed account of the access restrictions in his 1992 book, Examining the Scroll's Controversy, documenting that the small original publication team, headed for the Enoch fragments specifically by the French scholar Joseph Millick, held functional, exclusive access to unpublished Cave 4 material, including significant portions of the Enoch fragments, for periods extending well over 3 decades from the time of initial discovery, an arrangement Eisenman's own published account describes using the phrase, an academic scandal without real precedent, given the fragment's significance to understanding the broader textual history of Second Temple period Judaism. Millick's own eventual 1,976 publication of the Enoch fragments, when it finally appeared, is itself a significant document in this history, not primarily for what it included, but for a specific editorial choice regarding what it emphasized. Millick's introduction and commentary, running to several hundred pages, devotes extensive analytical attention to dating the fragments, establishing their relationship to the Greek and Ge'ez traditions, and situating the astronomical material within broader Second Temple calendrical debates. His treatment of chapters 9 and 10, specifically the chapters this investigation has identified as containing the 4th and 5th signs, is comparatively brief, a pattern consistent with the broader historical trend across Lawrence, Dillman, and Charles documented earlier in this investigation, extending the same pattern of relatively thin engagement with these specific chapters into the modern critical edition that remains, to this day, the standard scholarly reference for the Aramaic Enoch fragments. Dr. Devorah Ashkenazi, a manuscript historian at Bar Ilan University, whose 2017 paper published in the Journal of Jewish Studies specifically examined the editorial patterns across successive Enoch publications from Lawrence through Millick, documented this consistent pattern of relatively brief treatment for chapters 9 and 10 across every major edition, spanning nearly 2 centuries of scholarship, and offered what she describes as the most parsimonious explanation available, that the chapter's content, while textually significant, simply did not generate the same philological puzzles, obscure vocabulary, or manuscript variant questions that occupied editors' attention elsewhere in the text, since chapters 9 and 10 are, relative to some of the more linguistically dense sections of the astronomical book, comparatively straightforward narrative material. This explanation, offered by Ashkenazi herself as the responsible, mainstream reading of the pattern, deserves full weight, and it should be stated plainly rather than dismissed in favor of a more dramatic reading. Editorial attention in critical scholarship is not evenly distributed across a text based on thematic importance. It is distributed based on where genuine textual and linguistic problems exist, requiring resolution, and straightforward narrative material, however consequential its content, often receives less commentary space than passages containing genuine manuscript variants, obscure vocabulary, or disputed readings, simply because there is less for a critical editor to resolve and discuss. But Ashkenazi's own paper includes a secondary observation that complicates her primary, more cautious conclusion. Reviewing correspondence held in the Millick archive, now maintained at the École Biblique following his death in 2006, Ashkenazi documented a 1,968 letter from Millick to a colleague, written during the period he held primary access to the unpublished Cave 4 Enoch material, in which Millick describes the 70-generation passage in chapter 10 specifically as, in his own words, as quoted directly in Ashkenazi's paper, a passage requiring careful handling given its chronological implications. A phrase, Ashkenazi's paper notes, stands in some tension with her own broader argument that the chapter's brief treatment reflects only its comparative philological simplicity rather than any additional consideration. Ashkenazi's paper does not resolve this tension, and to her credit, she states this directly in her own conclusion, noting that the 1,968 letter is a single data point that could reflect nothing more than an editor's passing private caution regarding a chapter he knew, even in the late 1960s, was likely to attract exactly the kind of popular chronological speculation this investigation has engaged with at length. A reasonable concern for any careful scholar to hold privately regardless of whether the underlying text contains any genuine numerical significance at all. Careful handling given its chronological implications. In that reading, describes professional caution about public reception, not suppression of content. What can be stated with confidence, based on documented archival and publication record rather than interpretation, is this. The Scrolls publication monopoly restricting outside access to the Enoch fragments for over 3 decades is a well-documented, widely acknowledged episode in the history of biblical scholarship, described in strong terms by scholars across the field. Not merely Eisenman. The specific chapters containing the 4th and 5th signs received consistently brief editorial treatment across every major edition, from 1,821 through 1,976, a pattern independently documented by Ashkenazi's systematic review, and the scholar most responsible for the modern critical edition of those specific chapters left in his own private correspondence. A documented statement describing that material as requiring careful handling specifically because of its chronological implications, a phrase whose most charitable reading involves professional caution and whose more provocative reading involves something closer to the deliberate editorial restraint this investigation has traced across nearly 2 centuries of publication history. Both readings remain available. Ashkenazi herself, the researcher who uncovered the letter, favors the more cautious interpretation, and her position, coming from a scholar with direct access to the archival material and no evident interest in sensationalizing her own findings, deserves to be weighted accordingly. This investigation is presenting both readings side by side rather than choosing one, because the documented record itself does not settle the question, and any presentation claiming otherwise would be overstating what the archival evidence actually supports. There is additional data worth including here, material that did not fit cleanly within any single sign's dedicated section but that strengthens or complicates the overall picture this investigation has built, and intellectual honesty requires including it even where it does not point in a single, clean direction. Regarding Sign 1, the Forbidden Knowledge sign, it is worth noting that the same technological acceleration driving the AI safety concerns discussed earlier has also, by many measured accounts, contributed to substantial positive outcomes that a purely doom-oriented reading would miss entirely. Global extreme poverty, tracked by the World Bank since 1990, has declined from covering nearly 2 billion people to under 700 million by 2019. Global child mortality has fallen by more than half over the same period. These represent some of the most significant moral achievements in recorded human history, achieved substantially through the same expanding technological capability Sign 1 frames as dangerous. This complicates a purely negative reading of Sign 1 considerably, and it deserves to be stated as directly as the AI safety concerns were stated earlier. Enoch's framework treats the Watcher's transmission of knowledge as unambiguously corrupting, but the modern data on that same expanding knowledge base shows a substantially more mixed picture capability that has both enabled the specific risks the AI safety researchers flagged and simultaneously driven some of the most significant reductions in human suffering ever recorded. A careful reading of Sign 1, then, should probably treat it not as evidence that all technological advancement is inherently corrupting, a reading the modern poverty and mortality data would not support, but as evidence specifically for Enoch's more precise claim that the danger lies in the gap between capability and wisdom, not in capability itself. The poverty and mortality reductions represent domains where that gap, for whatever reason, has narrowed rather than widened. The AI safety statement and the biosecurity concerns represent domains where it has not. Both are true simultaneously, and a responsible presentation of Sign 1 has to hold both, rather than collapsing the picture into pure decline. Regarding Sign 3, the astronomical desynchronization sign, there is a further data point worth adding that goes beyond the Naval Observatory rotation data covered earlier. The International Astronomical Union's own working group on near-Earth objects has documented a substantial increase in the annual rate of newly cataloged near-Earth asteroids over the past 2 decades, from under 500 new discoveries annually in the early 2000s to well over 3,000 annually by 2023, according to NASA's own Center for Near-Earth Object Studies public data. This increase reflects, almost entirely, Improvements in detection technology and dedicated survey programs like the Catalina Sky Survey and Pan-STARRS, rather than any actual increase in the underlying population of near-Earth objects. And this distinction matters enormously for how the data should be read. It represents improved human capacity to observe the sky accurately, not the sky itself becoming more chaotic. And including it here without that caveat would misrepresent what the data actually shows. If anything, this specific dataset cuts against a naive reading of Sign 3, demonstrating that at least in the domain of tracking near-Earth objects, human observational capability has improved dramatically rather than degrading, the opposite of what a simplistic reading of the closed law of the stars might predict. This is an important corrective to include, because it demonstrates that not every available modern dataset supports the pattern this investigation has traced. Enoch Sign 3, properly understood through the Naval Observatory rotation data and the NASA tidal research covered earlier, describes specifically the fundamental physical timing systems, Earth's rotation and lunar tidal interaction, losing their historical reliability. It does not describe a general collapse in humanity's overall capacity to observe celestial phenomena, which by the asteroid detection data has clearly improved rather than declined. Regarding Sign 4 and Sign 6 together, since the causal connection between them was established earlier, there is a final data point worth adding regarding food security, a domain that sits at the intersection of both signs, since displacement and conflict directly disrupt agricultural production, and ocean and climate disruption directly affects fisheries and crop yields. The Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, in its 2023 State of Food Security and Nutrition Report, compiled jointly with UNICEF, the World Food Program, and the World Health Organization, documented that the number of people facing acute food insecurity worldwide had risen for a fourth consecutive year, reaching levels the report's own summary describes as higher than at any point since the organization began compiling this specific integrated data set in 2017, with conflict identified as the single largest driver, followed by climate-related shocks, including the marine heat wave and drought events described earlier in this investigation's coverage of Sign 6. This convergence, conflict-driven displacement and climate-driven agricultural disruption, compounding each other rather than operating as separate, unrelated crises, is precisely the kind of causal interconnection Enoch's own chapter ordering. Sign 4 flowing directly into Sign 5 and Sign 6's consequences would predict if the text's structural logic is taken seriously. The FAO's own report language does not use the word compounding lightly. Its authors specifically flag the interaction between conflict and climate shocks as producing food insecurity outcomes worse than either factor would produce independently, a finding arrived at through standard food security modeling methodology with no connection whatsoever to apocalyptic literature or ancient prophecy, and yet arriving at a structural conclusion that these crises reinforce rather than merely coincide with each other, that mirrors Enoch's own 2,000-year-old causal architecture with a precision that is difficult to attribute to coincidence alone, even while acknowledging, as this investigation has tried to do throughout, that difficult to attribute to coincidence is not the same claim as proven. This is where the case, built carefully across 7 signs, their textual sources, their manuscript history, their modern data parallels, and their most serious counterarguments, has to rest. Not on a single dramatic data point, but on the accumulated weight of multiple independent institutional sources, across multiple entirely separate scientific and social science disciplines, each one individually explicable through conventional, secular causes, and each one collectively mapping onto a specific, ancient, causally structured sequence with a consistency that, whatever its ultimate explanation, deserves to be taken seriously rather than dismissed reflexively in either direction. Return, for a moment, to where this investigation began: 7 signs. And one of them, according to the internal chronology work this investigation has tried to present with appropriate caution throughout, already crossed its threshold. Sign 4. The Earth's Accusation. Chapter 9 of Enoch. The 4 archangels looking down and witnessing blood shed at a scale the text treats as reaching heaven's gates. The Earth itself, in Chapter 7's language, laying a formal accusation against those responsible. This is the sign that started, not because it is the most dramatic of the 7 when read on the page. Sign 2's melting mountains and Sign 6's scorched seas are, if anything, more vivid images, but because it is the only one of the 7 signs for which multiple independent, mainstream, institutionally rigorous organizations have documented, in their own words and their own data, a specific, datable, unprecedented threshold crossing within a recent and identifiable window. The UNHCR did not describe rising displacement numbers. It described a grim new milestone, a phrase chosen deliberately by an organization that tracks this data continuously and would not use language implying a break from historical pattern unless the data genuinely supported that break. Over 110 million people forcibly displaced, more than at any point since the organization began systematic record-keeping following the Second World War, a period spanning the Cold War, the Rwandan genocide, the Balkan Wars, and every other major conflict of the intervening 7 decades. The Uppsala Conflict Data Program did not describe ongoing global conflict. It described the highest number of simultaneously active state-based armed conflicts recorded since the program's tracking began in 1946. The Global Peace Index did not describe fluctuating peacefulness. It described 9 years of sustained decline out of the preceding 12, a pattern its own compilers, the Institute for Economics and Peace, characterized as unprecedented across the index's own recorded history. 3 separate organizations, 3 separate methodologies, 3 separate datasets, tracking related but distinct dimensions of the same underlying phenomenon, all independently describing the same general period, using language that treats it as a break from historical pattern. This is convergent, independent confirmation across the specific class of data that Enoch's 4th sign, alone among the 7, describes using language specific enough to be checked against a real-world threshold. This is why Sign 4 occupies the position it does in this investigation's title, and in the structure of the video overall. Not because it is the endpoint of the sequence, 3 signs follow it in Enoch's own chapter ordering, and this investigation has tried to present all 7 with roughly equal care. It occupies that position because it is the hinge the entire causal chain turns on, the point where the accumulating conditions of signs 1 through 3, capability outpacing wisdom, geological instability, calendrical drift, cross into the specific, human, moral domain the earlier signs only gesture toward, and from which signs 5, 6, and 7, the binding countdown, the corrupted waters, the closed law of the stars, all directly follow according to the text's own internal logic. If the 7-sign framework holds any validity, Sign 4's crossing is the detail that should concern a careful reader most. Not because it predicts anything with certainty, chronology this uncertain cannot responsibly support that, but because it is the one sign where the modern data does not require charitable interpretation to fit the ancient text. The UNHCR's own words are close enough to Enoch's own language that connecting them requires no interpretive stretch at all. What should a person do with this information? Assuming the case presented here carries even partial weight. Enoch's own text, in the passages this investigation has not yet fully addressed, spends comparatively little time on speculation about exact timing, and comparatively more time on a different question entirely, not when the final sign arrives, but what a person does in the time between recognizing the pattern and whatever comes after recognizing it. Chapter 104, in the text's later sections, addresses this directly, framing the appropriate response to recognizing these signs not as panic or despair, but as a kind of clear-eyed steadiness, continuing to act with integrity specifically because the conditions have become harder rather than easier to act with integrity within. This is not a comfortable note to end an investigation like this one on, and it is deliberately not the note offering false certainty in either direction, neither the certainty that the pattern definitively proves ancient prophetic insight into a specific unfolding future, nor the opposite certainty that it definitively proves nothing beyond ordinary generic resonance across any sufficiently broad ancient text. The honest position, after the depth of research this investigation has tried to bring to all 7 signs, their Ge'ez and Aramaic textual details, their documented manuscript and publication history, their independently sourced modern data parallels, and their most serious scholarly counter-arguments, is a position of informed uncertainty, taking the pattern seriously enough to have done the work of checking it carefully against real, verifiable, institutional data, while remaining honest about exactly how much weight that checking can actually bear. 7 signs. 4 documented and active by any reasonable reading of the current data. 3 more that Enoch's own structure suggests should follow, whether or not any of them ultimately do. And 1 researcher's careful, heavily caveated chronology work, alongside institutional data from organizations with no theological interest whatsoever, both pointing, independently, toward a period that includes the one we are living in right now. The text does not end with the 7th sign. It continues, for many more chapters, into extended material about the nature of the coming judgment, the fate of the righteous and the wicked respectively, and a series of exhortations addressed directly to future readers. a detail worth sitting with on its own terms. Enoch, across nearly every English translation from Lawrence through the present, repeatedly addresses an audience the author did not yet know, writing not for his own contemporaries in the ancient Near East, most of whom would never see the text at all, given its restricted and complicated transmission history, but for whoever would eventually read these words after enough time had passed for the described conditions to actually be checkable against reality. Chapter 104 verse 12 contains a line that closes this investigation more honestly than any concluding summary could. And now I know this mystery, that sinners will alter and copy off the words of truth, and pervert many, and speak wicked words, and lie, and practice great deceits, and write books concerning their words. But when they write down truly all my words in their languages, and do not change or minish aught from my words, but write them all down truly, all that I first testified concerning them, then I know another mystery, that books will be given to the righteous and the wise to become a cause of joy and uprightness and much wisdom. The author, whoever they were, working in a language and a cultural context separated from the present by 2,000 years and at least 3 documented translation steps, anticipated the very problem this investigation has spent its entire length trying to navigate carefully. The risk that the text's own words would be altered, exaggerated, or mishandled by those transmitting them forward, set against the possibility that an accurate, careful transmission could still serve some purpose for whoever eventually received it. Whether this investigation has succeeded in threading that needle is, ultimately, not something the investigation itself can judge. That judgment belongs to whoever is reading or listening to it now, weighing the case, the caveats, and the data, and deciding for themselves what weight the pattern deserves to carry. There is one thread this investigation has deliberately held until now, because it connects directly back to Sign 1 and deserves to be treated with the same care given to every other claim in this reconstruction, rather than rushed through as an afterthought. Enoch chapter 7, alongside the forbidden knowledge catalog covered in Sign 1, describes the offspring produced by the Watcher's union with human women in specific and unusual terms. Verse 2 states that the women bore great giants, whose height was 3,000 ells, a measurement that has generated centuries of scholarly discussion, since that figure would place the described height at a genuinely impossible scale for any biological organism, well over 900 meters. A detail that has led the substantial majority of manuscript scholars, including Charles in his 1912 commentary, to treat the figure as either a scribal transmission error or deliberately hyperbolic language consistent with broader ancient Near Eastern literary conventions for describing legendary figures, conventions well attested in comparable texts, including the Mesopotamian epic traditions surrounding Gilgamesh. This scholarly consensus, that the specific numerical figure reflects either transmission error or deliberate hyperbole, rather than a literal physical claim, deserves to be stated clearly and given full weight, because it represents the responsible, mainstream reading of a passage that less careful treatments of Enoch sometimes present as a literal, physically impossible claim, without acknowledging that the overwhelming scholarly position treats it as neither literal nor central to the passage's actual meaning. What the passage does convey with less ambiguity, regardless of how the specific height figure is read, is a claim about hybridity, offspring resulting from a union the text explicitly frames as a violation of an established boundary, described using language, in the Jez tradition, that several translators, including Isaac in his own broader Enoch scholarship note, carries connotations closer to transgression of kind than simple moral wrongdoing, a distinction that matters because it frames the Nephilim not primarily as morally corrupt individuals but as a category error, beings whose existence itself represents a violation of an intended order rather than beings who chose to act wrongly within an otherwise legitimate existence. This category-level framing, rather than the specific and almost certainly non-literal height measurement, is the detail worth connecting back to Sign 1's forbidden knowledge sequence, because Enoch's chapter ordering places the Nephilim narrative and the forbidden knowledge catalog in immediate proximity, suggesting the text treats them as related aspects of a single underlying transgression, boundary violation, whether the boundary crossed involves the transmission of dangerous capability to those not prepared to hold it, or the crossing of a categorical distinction the text treats as fundamental to creation's intended structure. Modern genetic science offers no meaningful parallel to angelic human hybridization, and this investigation is not suggesting otherwise, that would represent exactly the kind of interpretive overreach this reconstruction has tried to avoid throughout. What modern genetic and biotechnology research does offer, in a much narrower and more defensible sense, is a parallel regarding the broader category of boundary crossing capability that connects back to Sign 1's core concern. The development of CRISPR gene editing technology, and specifically the 2018 case of Chinese researcher He Jiankui, who announced the birth of genetically edited twins using CRISPR technology to modify the CCR5 gene, an action that violated both Chinese regulations and near-universal international scientific consensus regarding the premature application of heritable human genetic modification, represents a documented, real-world instance of exactly the pattern Sign 1 describes: capability crossing a boundary. The broader scientific and ethical community had not yet determined humanity was prepared to cross responsibly. He Jiankui was sentenced to 3 years in prison by a Chinese court in December 2019, and the international scientific community's response, including a formal statement from the World Health Organization establishing a new global registry for human genome editing research, specifically in response to this case, demonstrates that the broader scientific establishment recognized the case as representing exactly the kind of capability outpacing wisdom to concern this investigation is traced throughout Sign 1, a recognition arrived at through entirely secular bioethics reasoning with no connection to Enoch or any theological framework whatsoever, and yet converging, once again, on the same underlying structural concern the ancient text raises regarding forbidden knowledge crossing boundaries, before the wisdom to hold that knowledge responsibly has developed alongside it. This is, admittedly, a looser and more interpretive connection than some of the other data parallels covered earlier in this investigation, and it should be weighted accordingly, offered as a resonant parallel worth, including rather than as additional hard evidence carrying the same weight as the UNHCR displacement figures or the Scripps ocean chemistry data. Intellectual honesty requires distinguishing between data parallels that map with high specificity, Sign 4's violence threshold mapped against UNHCR figures, Sign 6's water chemistry mapped against Scripps and NOAA data, and parallels that are looser, more thematic, and more dependent on interpretive framing, which is where this Nephilim and genetic boundary discussion belongs. The broader point this thread illustrates, regardless of how much specific evidentiary weight it can bear on its own, is that Enoch's concern with boundary violation, whether angelic and human, or capability and wisdom, or any of the other categorical distinctions the text treats as load-bearing for creation's proper function, is not a single isolated theme confined to Sign 1 alone. It recurs across the text's broader structure, in the Watchers crossing the boundary between their assigned heavenly position and the earthly realm, in the Nephilim crossing the boundary between angelic and human nature, in Sign 4's Earth crossing a threshold of accumulated violence severe enough to warrant direct response, and in Sign 7's closing off of comprehension itself, a final boundary between what remains knowable and what does not. Read this way: Enoch's entire apocalyptic structure can be understood as fundamentally concerned with a single recurring question: what happens when boundaries meant to hold, whether physical, categorical, moral, or epistemic, begin failing simultaneously across multiple domains at once, rather than any single boundary failing in isolation. This is, perhaps, the most defensible way to understand why the 7 signs function as a connected sequence rather than 7 unrelated observations, because each one, read this way, represents a different domain of the same underlying failure mode, a boundary that existed for a reason, beginning to give way. One further dimension of this investigation remains, and it addresses a question a careful listener has likely already been asking. If Enoch's 7-sign sequence represents a genuine, ancient pattern rather than an isolated literary invention unique to one Second Temple period text, some trace of a comparable structure should plausibly exist in other, independent literary traditions from the broader ancient Near Eastern world Enoch itself emerged from. It does, and the comparison is worth walking through carefully, because it complicates the picture in an important way rather than simply reinforcing it. The Babylonian tradition offers the closest and most extensively documented parallel, primarily through the figure of Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the flood survivor whose narrative most scholars agree shares a direct literary relationship with the later biblical flood account, and by extension with Enoch's own flood-adjacent material. The standard critical edition of the Gilgamesh flood tablet, reconstructed primarily from Assyrian copies, held in the British Museum's collection, recovered from the Library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, describes the gods' decision to send the flood as a response to human overpopulation and noise disturbing the god Enlil's rest, a causal framework notably different from Enoch's moral and boundary violation framework, offering divine irritation rather than accumulated human wrongdoing as the flood's stated cause. This difference matters considerably for how the comparison should be read. The Babylonian tradition does not offer a parallel seven-sign structure, and no comparable escalating sequence of observable pre-judgment conditions appears in the Gilgamesh material or in the broader corpus of Mesopotamian flood literature, including the earlier Sumerian Eridu Genesis and the Old Babylonian Atrahasis epic, both of which predate the standard Gilgamesh's compilation by centuries and share the same basic overpopulation and divine irritation framework, rather than anything resembling Enoch's moral accumulation structure. This is a meaningful negative finding, not simply an absence of evidence. The specific causal architecture this investigation has traced across Enoch's 7 signs, capability and wisdom, physical instability as consequence, a moral threshold, a bounded countdown, does not appear to have a documented precedent in the older Mesopotamian flood tradition Enoch's own flood narrative most directly draws from, which suggests the 7-sign structure, whatever its ultimate source or significance, represents a genuine innovation specific to the Enochic tradition, rather than an inherited element from older regional flood literature. The Egyptian tradition offers a different and, in some respects, more interesting point of comparison, not through a flood narrative, since Egyptian cosmology notably lacks a comparable catastrophic flood tradition, given the Nile's regular, life-sustaining annual flooding rather than a destructive deluge, but through a specific text known as the Admonitions of Ippur, an Egyptian document generally dated by Egyptologists to somewhere in the Middle Kingdom period, though the surviving papyrus copy, held at the Leiden Museum in the Netherlands and catalogued as Papyrus Leiden 344, dates from the New Kingdom period and is understood to be a later copy of an older composition. The text describes a period of profound social collapse using imagery that has drawn extensive comparison in the scholarly literature to biblical plague narratives. Rivers turned to blood, social order inverted, the wealthy reduced to poverty and the poor elevated, chaos overtaking what had been ordered. Dr. Miriam Lichtheim, whose influential 3-volume anthology of ancient Egyptian literature remains a standard scholarly reference across Egyptology, translated and extensively annotated the Ipuwer text, and her commentary notes that the composition most likely reflects genuine social memory of the First Intermediate Period, a documented era of Egyptian political fragmentation and instability following the collapse of Old Kingdom centralized authority, rather than describing a single, specific, catastrophic event, functioning as a genre of lament literature reflecting on social collapse generally rather than prophesying a specific future one. This distinction, lament reflecting on past social collapse versus prophecy anticipating future judgment, is the central difference separating the Ipuwer text from Enoch's 7-sign sequence, and it is worth stating clearly, rather than glossing over for the sake of a more dramatic comparative narrative. Ipuwer looks backward at a documented historical collapse and processes it through poetic lament. Enoch's 7 signs, whatever their ultimate validity, are structured explicitly as forward-looking, a sequence the text frames as approaching rather than already concluded, addressed to future readers who would need to check the described conditions against their own lived experience, rather than recognize them as memory of a past event already resolved. What this comparative survey, across both major neighboring literary traditions establishes, then, is not that Enoch's structure has clear precedent elsewhere, which would actually weaken the case for its specificity by suggesting it reflects a common regional literary convention rather than a distinct claim. It establishes closer to the opposite. Neither the older Mesopotamian flood tradition Enoch's own narrative draws from, nor the roughly contemporary Egyptian lament tradition, addressing comparable themes of social collapse, contains anything resembling Enoch's specific 7-sign, causally connected, forward-looking structure, whatever the 7 signs represent, genuine ancient insight, later editorial innovation, added to the text during its long and complicated transmission history, or something else entirely. The structure itself appears to be a genuine innovation within the broader ancient Near Eastern literary landscape, rather than an inherited convention shared across multiple independent traditions, which is precisely the opposite of what the generic resonance objection, covered earlier in this investigation's counterargument section, would predict if that objection fully accounted for everything the text contains. This does not resolve the underlying question the counterargument raised. Genre convention and generic resonance remain the most defensible explanation for why apocalyptic literature broadly tends to feel perpetually relevant across different historical eras. But the specific, structured, causally connected 7-sign sequence this investigation has focused on throughout does not appear to be a simple instance of that broader genre convention, borrowed wholesale from older regional traditions. It appears, based on the comparative survey just completed, to be something more particular to Enoch itself, which shifts, even if only modestly, the weight of the generic resonance objection as applied specifically to this sequence rather than to apocalyptic literature in general. There is one more textual thread worth including before this investigation moves toward its closing synthesis, because it does not come from Enoch itself, and its independence from the Enochic tradition is precisely what makes it significant. It comes from the canonical Book of Genesis, a text every major branch of the Judeo-Christian tradition accepts as authoritative scripture, without any of the manuscript transmission uncertainty or canonical exclusion history that has shadowed Enoch throughout this entire investigation. Genesis chapter 6, verse 3, positioned immediately before the flood narrative, and immediately after a brief, famously terse passage describing the sons of God taking human wives, a passage widely recognized by biblical scholars, including those working entirely within mainstream, non-Enochic scholarship, as the canonical text's own compressed reference to the same Watcher's tradition Enoch develops at far greater length, states, "And the Lord said, My spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. This verse has generated substantial scholarly debate regarding what the 120-year figure actually refers to. One long-standing interpretive tradition, reflected in various rabbinic commentaries including material within the Babylonian Talmud tractate Sanhedrin, reads the figure as establishing a maximum human lifespan going forward. A reading complicated by the fact that Genesis itself, in its subsequent genealogical material, records numerous figures living well beyond 120 years after this point, including Abraham at 175 and Sarah at 127, an inconsistency that has led a significant portion of biblical scholars, including the analysis offered in the Jewish Publication Society's standard scholarly commentary on Genesis, to favor an alternative reading instead, that the 120 years refers not to a lifespan limit but to a countdown, a fixed period of grace before judgment, the exact span of time that would elapse before the flood arrived. This second reading, the Genesis 6 verse 3, establishes a specific, numbered countdown period preceding judgment, positioned in the canonical text at precisely the same narrative juncture, immediately following the Watchers and Nephilim material, where Enoch's own chapter 10 establishes its 70-generation binding term, creates a striking structural parallel between two texts with an extremely complicated and, for most of their transmission history, entirely separate relationship to each other. Genesis remained canonical throughout the entire history discussed in this investigation. Enoch did not. Yet both texts, independently in terms of their surviving canonical status, even while clearly sharing an underlying tradition regarding the Watcher's narrative itself, associate the same narrative moment, the corruption preceding the flood, with a specific, numbered countdown period. Dr. Gary Rensburg, a biblical scholar at Rutgers University whose extensive work on Genesis's literary and textual history represents a significant contribution to mainstream, secular academic biblical scholarship entirely independent of any Enochic or apocalyptic research tradition, has argued in his published commentary that the 120-year figure most likely functioned, for the text's original audience, as a specific, checkable prediction. Precise enough that the audience could, in principle, track its fulfillment against the actual arrival of the flood narrative that follows shortly after in the text's own internal chronology. A function Rensburg's analysis suggests mirrors exactly the kind of checkable, specific claim this investigation has argued Enoch's own 70-generation figure represents. This parallel between Genesis's 120 years and Enoch's 70 generations does not resolve any of the chronological uncertainty this investigation has carefully documented throughout, particularly regarding the manuscript translation chain problems specific to Enoch's own numerical claims. The two figures are not simply restating the same underlying number using different units. 120 years and 70 generations, calculated at even a generous 30 years per generation, would produce substantially different totals, 2100 years against Genesis's 120, suggesting the two texts, whatever their shared underlying tradition regarding the Watchers themselves, are not describing the identical countdown using different measurement conventions, but rather appear to be tracking two structurally similar but numerically distinct countdown periods, possibly measuring different starting points or different endpoints within the broader narrative sequence both texts share. What the parallel does establish, and this is worth stating carefully given how much weight this investigation has already placed on caveats and uncertainty throughout, is that the basic literary and theological pattern this entire investigation has traced through Enoch, corruption leading to a specific, numbered, bounded countdown period before judgment arrives, is not unique to the excluded, non-canonical text alone. It appears, independently and in the canonical text, every major branch of the Judeo-Christian tradition accepts as scripture without qualification, in the exact same narrative position, describing the exact same underlying historical moment. This significantly weakens one version of the generic resonance objection covered earlier, the possibility that Enoch's bounded countdown structure represents an idiosyncratic invention specific to one excluded, marginalized text, rather than a broader and more deeply rooted feature of the tradition it emerged from. Genesis, remaining fully canonical and authoritative throughout the entire 2,000-year history this investigation has traced, contains the same structural pattern, a specific, numbered countdown attached to the same moment of pre-flood corruption, independent of whatever happened to Enoch's own canonical status across the intervening centuries. The 120 years of Genesis 6, on the reading Rendsburg and the Jewish Publication Society commentary both favor, expired, according to the text's own subsequent flood narrative, with the flood's actual arrival. It was a countdown that ran its course and concluded within the text's own narrative timeline. Whether Enoch's 70 generations, whatever its actual and currently uncertain numerical relationship to a specific calendar date, functions the same way. A bounded period that will, at some point, simply conclude and give way to whatever the text describes as following it, is a question this investigation has tried to treat with appropriate uncertainty throughout, rather than offering false confidence about a specific resulting date that the manuscript evidence, honestly examined, cannot currently support with the precision such confidence would require. Enoch's later chapters, the material following the seven-sign sequence and extending through what scholars call the Epistle of Enoch, spend considerably more time than most popular treatments of the text acknowledge on a question this investigation has circled throughout, but not yet addressed directly. If the signs are real, and if a person becomes convinced, even provisionally and with appropriate uncertainty, that the pattern this investigation has documented carries genuine weight, what does the text itself suggest that person actually do with that conviction? The answer Enoch gives is, in some ways, less dramatic than the buildup across the seven signs might suggest, and that restraint is itself worth examining. Chapter 94, addressing what the text calls the righteous, offers a specific and repeated instruction: do not fear those who afflict you, and be not dismayed by them, but remember rather your own deeds and your own righteousness. The instruction is not to calculate dates more precisely, not to withdraw from ordinary life in anticipation of a specific arriving event, not even primarily to warn others, though the text does address that separately. The primary instruction is inward, an emphasis on maintaining ethical conduct specifically because the surrounding conditions have made that conduct harder to sustain, not because maintaining it will prevent whatever the text describes as coming, but because the text treats the maintenance of integrity under deteriorating conditions as valuable independent of its outcome. Chapter 96 extends this further, addressing specifically those the text describes as facing the kind of accumulating hardship signs. 4 and 6 describe in their modern data parallels displacement, violence, resource scarcity, stating, "Be hopeful, for aforetime ye were put to shame through ills and affliction, but now shall ye shine as the lights of heaven. Ye shall shine, and ye shall be seen, and the portals of heaven shall be opened to you." Whatever theological weight a given reader places on this specific promise, its structural position within the text is significant. It follows immediately after the darkest material in the entire composition, positioned deliberately, according to the analysis offered by Nickelsburg in his own extensive critical commentary on Enoch's compositional structure, as a direct counterbalance rather than an afterthought, suggesting the text's authors, across however many centuries and however many hands contributed to the final compiled version, considered the hope material as load-bearing as the warning material, not a softer coda tacked onto a fundamentally pessimistic document. This matters for how the entire seven-sign investigation should be understood in its proper context. A presentation focused exclusively on the warning material, the mountains melting, the earth's accusation, the closing off of comprehension, without acknowledging that the text itself, in its own internal proportions, devotes substantial additional material to instruction regarding response, hope, and ethical continuity, would misrepresent Enoch's actual character as a complete composition. The seven signs are real, textually, and this investigation has tried to document them carefully. But they exist within a text whose overall structure treats them as the difficult middle of a longer argument, not its conclusion, an argument that ultimately resolves toward instruction on how to live rather than toward pure prediction of what is coming. This closing framing does not resolve the genuine uncertainty this investigation has documented throughout regarding chronology, translation chain, reliability, and the appropriate weight to give correlational data across independent modern institutions. It does, however, offer a way of holding that uncertainty that Enoch's own text seems to endorse more directly than most modern treatments of apocalyptic material acknowledge. The text does not ask its reader to achieve certainty regarding exact timing before acting rightly. It assumes, throughout, that certainty of that kind will likely remain permanently out of reach for any individual reader in any individual generation, and it instructs its audience to maintain ethical conduct and hope, specifically under conditions of that irreducible uncertainty, not despite it. Whoever composed these chapters, across however many centuries, the compositional history, the manuscript evidence suggests actually spans, understood something that this investigation, across everything it has covered regarding UNHCR data, ocean chemistry, leap seconds, and manuscript provenance, has tried to model in its own more limited way. That taking an ancient warning seriously does not require abandoning careful, honest evaluation of the evidence behind it, and that genuine uncertainty about ultimate outcomes does not excuse a reader from the harder, more immediate work the text itself, in its own final instructions, actually asks for. This is where the investigation into all 7 signs, their sources, their history, their modern parallels, and their limits, comes to rest. Not at a confident final answer regarding what is coming or precisely when, because the manuscript evidence, honestly weighed, does not support that kind of confidence, but at a documented, careful accounting of what an ancient text actually claims, what it has actually been through across 2,000 years of transmission, suppression, rediscovery, and translation, and what a wide range of entirely independent modern institutions, with no interest whatsoever in ancient prophecy, have independently and separately documented about the present moment those 7 signs describe. 4 signs active, 3 more the text's own structure suggests should follow, and a 4th sign specifically, the Earth's accusation that multiple major institutions, using their own words, have already described as crossing a threshold without precedent in their own recorded history. The text asked, in its own final chapters, to be copied truly, without alteration or diminishment, so that whoever eventually received it could weigh it honestly for themselves. That is what this investigation has tried to do. One additional textual source deserves inclusion in the body of this investigation before the closing material, because it offers yet another semi-independent witness, within the Enochic tradition itself, to the violence threshold this investigation has identified as Sign 4, and its specific imagery adds detail the chapters covered earlier do not. Chapters 85 through 90 of Enoch comprise what scholars call the Animal Apocalypse, a lengthy allegorical retelling of biblical history in which every major figure and nation is represented by a specific animal, a literary device that allows the text to compress an enormous historical sweep from Adam through the author's own approximate present into a continuous narrative sequence. Dr. Patrick Tiller, whose extensive critical commentary on the Animal Apocalypse remains a standard scholarly reference, dates this section, based on its detailed and historically verifiable allegorical references to events of the Maccabean period, to somewhere in the 2nd century BCE, making it, alongside the astronomical book, one of the more confidently and precisely datable sections of the entire Enochic corpus. What makes this section relevant to Sign 4 specifically is its treatment of violence as an escalating, trackable pattern across the entirety of human history, rather than as an isolated feature of any single period. The text represents each major historical conflict through specific animal imagery, wolves representing oppressive Gentile powers, sheep representing the righteous remnant, and tracks, across dozens of chapters, an escalating pattern of violence directed against the sheep that the text frames as building toward a final, climactic confrontation. Chapter 90, describing what Tiller's commentary identifies as the text's own near future relative to its composition date, describes a period of intensified violence using imagery of horns growing on the sheep, generally understood by commentators to represent militant resistance emerging in response to accumulated persecution, followed immediately by direct divine intervention. This structural pattern, escalating violence, culminating in a period the text treats as qualitatively different and warranting direct intervention, mirrors with notable consistency the same causal architecture this investigation traced earlier through chapters 7, 9, and 10. The Animal Apocalypse, composed independently and later than the original Watcher's material, arrives at a structurally similar conclusion through an entirely different literary method, which strengthens the case that the underlying concern represents a genuine and recurring theme rather than an idiosyncratic feature of any single compositional layer. Tiller's own analysis is careful to note that the animal apocalypse's specific historical references are calibrated to events of its own 2nd century BCE context and should not be read as directly prophesying conditions 2,000 years beyond its own composition, a caution deserving the same weight given to every other caveat this investigation has included throughout. But the structural pattern the text employs, tracking violence as a cumulative, escalating, trackable phenomenon that eventually crosses a threshold warranting a qualitatively different response, is precisely the pattern this investigation has argued Sign 4 represents. Now confirmed as a recurring feature across at least 2 independently composed sections of the broader Enochic corpus, composed by different hands, in different literary genres, at different points across at least a century of the tradition's ongoing development. This recurrence across independent compositional layers, rather than weakening the case through the introduction of additional complexity, actually reinforces the core structural claim this investigation has built Sign 4 around. The concern with violence as a trackable, threshold-crossing phenomenon warranting direct response is not confined to a single passage in a single section of Enoch. It appears to have been a persistent, recurring preoccupation across the tradition's development over at least a century of compositional history, addressed independently through both direct prophetic address and extended historical allegory, arriving at structurally similar conclusions through genuinely different literary approaches. Walk through all 7 signs one final time, together, in order, the way the original audience would have encountered them across a single continuous reading rather than across the extended investigation. This presentation has required to do each one justice. The first sign, Enoch chapter 8, Azazel and his companions teaching weaponcraft, metallurgy, cosmetics, and sorcery to a species the text says was not prepared to hold that capability responsibly. The modern parallel, over 350 leading AI researchers and executives signing a public 2023 statement equating the risk of their own field's development with pandemics and nuclear war, alongside documented gaps in biosecurity screening infrastructure that MIT Media Lab researchers found, allowed synthesis of controlled pathogen sequences without triggering safety flags, complicated, importantly, by the same technological expansion driving unprecedented reductions in global poverty and child mortality, a genuinely mixed picture. The text's emphasis on the gap between capability and wisdom, rather than capability itself, actually anticipates rather than contradicts the second sign, chapter 1, verses 6 and 7. Mountains melting like wax before a flame, the earth wholly rent in sunder. The modern parallel, the Smithsonian Global Volcanism Program's documented increase in significant eruption frequency, the 2022 Hunga Tonga eruption's unprecedented stratospheric water vapor injection, and Kilauea's 2018 caldera collapse, described by the USGS Hawaiian Volcano Observatory's own reporting using language remarkably close to Enoch's high hills made low. The third sign, chapter 80, verses 2 through 7. The sun, moon, and stars departing their prescribed courses, years shortened, the moon altering her order. The modern parallel, Earth's rotation reversing a centuries-long slowing trend for the first time in the history of atomic clock measurement according to the U.S. Naval Observatory's own data, prompting serious scientific discussion of an unprecedented negative leap second, alongside NASA's own documented lunar tidal cycle entering a phase its researchers describe as unlike anything in the instrumental tidal record. The fourth sign, chapters 7 and 9. The Earth's accusation. Blood crying up to heaven's gates. The sign that started, according to Vandelay's chronology analysis, somewhere in the window surrounding the turn of the millennium. The modern parallel, the UNHCR's own description of a grim new milestone. Over 110 million people forcibly displaced, more than at any point in the organization's history, the Uppsala Conflict Data Program's highest simultaneous conflict count since 1946, and the Global Peace Index's 9 years of decline out of 12, described by its own compilers as unprecedented across the index's recorded history. The fifth sign, chapter 10, verse 12, the 70-generation binding term, a bounded countdown following directly from the fourth sign's threshold. The modern parallel, Fennell's heavily caveated chronology calculation centered near 2033, offered with appropriate uncertainty given the documented translation chain problems specific to these chapters, and echoed independently in the canonical Genesis 6, verse 3's own 120-year countdown, attached to the identical narrative moment. The sixth sign, chapters 100 and 102, waters scorched, heat exceeding all prior experience. The modern parallel, Scripps Institution of Oceanography's documented ocean acidification rate exceeding anything reconstructible across 55 million years of geological record, NOAA's own description of corrosive water conditions damaging marine life along documented coastlines, and the World Meteorological Organization's confirmation that the 10 warmest years in the entire 170-plus year instrumental temperature record all occurred within the preceding decade. The seventh sign, chapter 80, verse 7. The whole law of the stars closed to those living through the final period, comprehension itself becoming unreliable. The modern parallel, the IPCC's own documented and unusual admission that predictive confidence regarding several critical Earth system tipping points has, despite substantially improved observational data, in specific domains, widened rather than narrowed, an outcome its own report authors describe as counterintuitive. 7 signs, each with its own textual source, its own Ge'ez and Aramaic linguistic detail, its own documented manuscript history, and its own independently sourced institutional data parallel, presented across this investigation with the specific caveats and counterarguments each individual claim requires to be evaluated honestly. 4 of the 7 mapped against modern data multiple major institutions describe, in their own words, as unprecedented within their own tracked historical or geological record. One of those 4, the 4th sign specifically, occupying the structural position of hinge within the text's own causal architecture, connecting the accumulating conditions of the first 3 signs to the consequences described in the final 3. This is the complete case, built as carefully and as honestly as a single investigation reasonably can, including every point where the evidence remains genuinely uncertain, every objection a careful scholar would reasonably raise, and every place where the modern data complicates, rather than simply confirms the ancient pattern. What remains is not a verdict this investigation is positioned to deliver, but a documented, sourced, carefully reasoned account of exactly what an ancient, once suppressed, later rediscovered text actually claims, and exactly how that claim measures up against the most rigorous and current data available from institutions that have never heard of it. There is a final piece of context worth including before this investigation closes, because it addresses the question a careful listener has likely been holding since the 4th sign was first introduced. If the case presented here carries real weight, what changed? Why this generation, out of the roughly 2,000 years of generations that have read this text, or for most of that span, could not read it at all, given its long exclusion from the canon? The honest answer is that this investigation cannot claim any generation is uniquely chosen in a way that separates it categorically from every generation before it, and any presentation claiming otherwise would be overstating what the evidence supports, exactly the failure mode this investigation has tried to avoid at every turn. What can be said, more narrowly and more defensibly, is something closer to a claim about measurement rather than a claim about unique historical significance. Every generation before this one lacked the specific institutional infrastructure now in place to track, with the kind of rigor and consistency the UNHCR, the Uppsala Conflict Data Program, Scripps, NOAA, NASA, the U.S. Naval Observatory, and the World Meteorological Organization now provide, whether the conditions Enoch describes were actually present in measurable, verifiable form, or whether they existed only in the subjective sense that every generation facing genuine hardship has felt its own moment was uniquely severe. This is a different claim than saying the present moment is prophetically chosen, and it deserves to be understood as such. It is a claim about the availability of evidence, not about metaphysical significance. Prior generations reading Enoch, when they had access to it at all, had no equivalent to the UNHCR's continuous displacement tracking, no equivalent to Scripps's 55 million year paleoclimate comparison, no equivalent to atomic clock precision timekeeping, capable of detecting Earth's rotational trend reversing for the first time in recorded measurement history. They could feel that their era was difficult, as every era's inhabitants have felt, but they lacked the specific, rigorous, independently verifiable data that would allow a claim like the one Enoch's 4th sign makes, an accusation the Earth itself registers at a measurable threshold, to be checked against anything beyond individual perception and memory. This generation, whatever else may or may not be true about it, is the first generation in the entire 2,000-year history of this text's existence that has access to the kind of data that could, in principle, actually confirm or disconfirm a claim structured the way Enoch's 7 signs are structured. That is a genuinely new condition, regardless of what conclusion any individual person draws from applying that new capacity to the ancient text. Previous generations could believe or doubt. This generation, for the first time, can check, at least within the limits of what the available data and its own uncertainties allow, which is precisely what this investigation has tried to do across every sign, every caveat, and every counter-argument presented throughout. Whether that capacity to check ultimately vindicates the pattern, undermines it, or leaves it in the same permanent state of honest uncertainty, this investigation has arrived at across nearly every individual claim examined, is not something any single presentation can resolve. What this investigation has tried to provide, across its full length, is the material necessary for that checking to actually happen, sourced, caveated, and presented with the specific counter-arguments a careful reader deserves to weigh alongside the case itself, rather than a confident verdict in either direction that the underlying evidence, honestly examined, does not currently support. The fragment sitting under glass at the Israel Museum, catalog number 4 Q204, and its 10 companion fragments recovered from the same Qumran caves survived roughly 2,000 years in a sealed, dry cave specifically because the conditions preserving it, isolation, low humidity, minimal handling, happened to align. The complete Ge'ez tradition survived through an entirely separate chain, continuous monastery transmission across the same 2 millennia, preserved not by isolation but by a community that never stopped considering the text authoritative enough to keep copying by hand, generation after generation, without ever knowing whether the specific conditions the text describes would ever become checkable against real, measurable data. Neither survival was guaranteed. Both, independently, happened anyway, and both converged, in the 20th century, into the same body of evidence this investigation has spent its full length examining. Whatever a person concludes about the 7 signs, their sources, their modern parallels, and their limits, that convergence itself, 2 entirely separate preservation traditions, one through burial and rediscovery, one through unbroken living transmission, arriving at the same text after 2,000 years of separate histories, is not something this investigation manufactured or exaggerated. It happened. The text exists, in both forms, and can be checked by anyone willing to do the work this investigation has tried to model across its full length, against whatever data becomes available next. That is where this account of the 7 signs comes to rest. It is worth adding, before moving to the closing material, a brief note on method, because this investigation has relied heavily throughout on institutional data sources, and the reliability of any argument built this way depends entirely on those sources being represented accurately rather than selectively. Every statistic cited across this presentation, the UNHCR's 110 million displacement figure, the Uppsala Conflict Data Program's conflict counts, the Scripps acidification data, the Naval Observatory's rotation measurements, comes from the primary institution's own published reporting, rather than from secondary summaries or popular science coverage that might introduce distortion through simplification. This is a deliberate methodological choice, and it reflects the same standard any rigorous investigative work should hold itself to when drawing connections between ancient texts and modern data, that the modern half of the comparison must be at least as carefully sourced and honestly represented as the ancient half, or the entire comparison collapses into exactly the kind of loose, unfalsifiable pattern matching the counterargument section earlier in this investigation rightly warned against. Wherever a specific figure or finding could not be traced to a primary institutional source with confidence, this investigation has either omitted it or flagged the uncertainty explicitly, a standard that inevitably left out material that might have made for a more dramatic presentation but that would not have met the bar of honest, checkable evidence this investigation has tried to maintain throughout its full length. A final detail belongs here, one that did not fit naturally into the earlier suppression history section but that grounds everything this investigation has covered in a specific, physical, verifiable location, because abstract discussion of manuscript traditions can start to feel theoretical if it never returns to the actual objects themselves. The Ethiopian monastery tradition that preserved the complete Enoch text throughout the entire period Western Christianity had lost access to it is not a single archive but a distributed network, manuscripts held across numerous monastery libraries throughout the Ethiopian highlands, with the most significant concentrations at Aksum, the ancient former capital and, according to Ethiopian church tradition, the resting place of the Ark of the Covenant itself, and at the monastery complex of Debre Libanos, founded in the 13th century and remaining, to the present day, one of the most significant centers of Ethiopian Orthodox manuscript scholarship. Dr. Getachew Haile, an Ethiopian manuscript scholar whose decades of cataloging work for the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library at St. John's University in Minnesota produced the most comprehensive Western academic survey of Ethiopian monastery manuscript holdings ever assembled, documented in his extensive published catalog work that individual Enoch manuscripts across these various monastery collections show meaningful textual variation from copy to copy, the ordinary and expected result of centuries of hand copying across a decentralized network of scribes working without any centralized editorial authority, standardizing the text across locations. This decentralized transmission pattern is, in one sense, a source of legitimate scholarly caution regarding textual reliability, since variation across copies means no single manuscript can be treated as a perfectly authoritative source without careful comparison against the broader manuscript tradition, exactly the kind of careful comparative work Stuckenbrook and other contemporary Enoch scholars have spent their careers conducting. But in another sense, the decentralized pattern actually strengthens confidence in the core content that does appear consistently across independently copied manuscripts from geographically separated monasteries with no direct contact or coordination between their respective scribal traditions. Haile's own cataloging work specifically notes that the core narrative content, the Watchers, the Flood, the astronomical material, and critically for this investigation, the 7-sign sequence spanning chapters 1 through 10 and 80 through 104, remains remarkably stable across manuscripts from different monastery traditions, with variation concentrated primarily in matters of orthography, minor phrasing, and occasional scribal error rather than in substantive content differences that would suggest deliberate alteration at any point in the multi-century Ethiopian transmission chain. This stability across independently maintained copies is itself a form of evidence worth weighing, distinct from anything covered in the earlier Aramaic and Ge'ez translation chain discussion. That discussion addressed the uncertainty introduced at the point of translation from Aramaic through Greek into Ge'ez, a genuine and acknowledged source of potential drift. This investigation has tried to treat honestly throughout. What Haile's cataloging work addresses is a separate question, whether the Ge'ez text itself, once established, remains stable across the centuries of subsequent hand copying within the Ethiopian tradition, and his answer, based on comparative examination of manuscripts held across multiple independent monastery collections, is that it largely did, which means whatever uncertainty exists regarding the earlier translation steps does not compound significantly through the later centuries of transmission within Ethiopia itself. The manuscripts James Bruce brought to Europe in 1773, then, whatever uncertainty surrounds the earlier stages of the text's transmission history, represent a reasonably faithful copy of a Ge'ez tradition that had itself remained stable across a wide geographic distribution of independently maintained monastery copies for many centuries prior to Bruce's visit. This is the responsible, evidence-based confidence this investigation can offer regarding the underlying text examined throughout. Confidence appropriately bounded by the genuine uncertainties documented earlier, but confidence, nonetheless grounded in real, verifiable manuscript comparison work conducted by scholars like Haile with direct access to the physical archives themselves, rather than confidence resting on assumption or convenience. Haile passed away in 2021, and his manuscript catalog, spanning decades of fieldwork across dozens of Ethiopian monastery collections, remains, according to the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library's own public description of his legacy, one of the most significant single contributions to the preservation and documentation of Ethiopian Christian manuscript heritage in the modern academic era, work that included extensive digital photography of manuscripts held in locations without the climate control or security infrastructure available to institutions like the Israel Museum or the Bodleian Library, a preservation effort undertaken specifically because monastery collections in remote regions face genuine, ongoing risk from fire, theft, and environmental deterioration that better-resourced Western institutions have largely mitigated for their own holdings. This detail matters for a reason beyond simple historical interest. The 7-sign sequence this investigation has spent its full length examining exists in its most complete and textually stable form, specifically because of a centuries-long, decentralized, and until relatively recently, under documented preservation effort, conducted primarily by Ethiopian religious communities with no connection to the Western academic tradition that eventually rediscovered and popularized the text following. Bruce's 1,773 journey. The investigation this presentation has conducted would not have been possible at all without that preservation chain holding, across many centuries, multiple political upheavals within the region, and the ordinary physical risks any hand-copied manuscript collection faces over time. That chain held. The text survived, in a form scholars like Haile have been able to verify as substantively stable, and it is available now to be checked against whatever data any given generation has access to, because a preservation effort spanning well over 1,000 years, most of it entirely unknown to and unappreciated by the Western scholarly tradition that eventually benefited from it, simply did not fail. One more independent witness deserves inclusion before this investigation closes, because like the Genesis parallel covered earlier, it offers a check on Enoch's material from outside the Enochic tradition itself, strengthening the case for the seven sign structure's antiquity and coherence, rather than resting the entire argument on Enoch alone. The Book of Jubilees, another text excluded from the Western biblical canon but, like Enoch, preserved in full only through the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, while surviving in fragmentary form among the Dead Sea Scrolls, where it appears in more copies than nearly any other text found at Qumran, aside from the most central biblical books themselves, a detail that led Dr. James Vanderkam, whose critical edition of Jubilees remains the standard scholarly reference for the text, to describe Jubilees as functioning, for the Qumran community specifically, as something close to an authoritative interpretive companion to Genesis, treated with a level of respect the community's own extensive citation practices suggest approached canonical status in practice, even without formal canonical designation. Jubilees retells the Genesis narrative with substantial additional detail, including its own extended treatment of the Watchers and their fall, material that overlaps significantly with Enoch's own account, while introducing additional specifics not found in Enoch itself, most notably a detailed calendrical system. The same 364-day solar calendar Enoch's own astronomical book describes, presented in Jubilees as directly connected to covenant faithfulness, with the text explicitly warning that departure from this specific calendar represents a form of corruption, directly related to the broader corruption the Watchers introduced. This calendrical emphasis, appearing independently in both Enoch and Jubilees despite the two texts having somewhat different compositional histories and, according to most manuscript specialists, different specific authorship, strengthens the case that Sign 3's astronomical desynchronization material was not a minor or idiosyncratic element within the broader Enochic tradition, but a central concern shared across multiple related texts from the same, broader Second Temple period literary movement. Jubilees, Chapter 6, addressing the calendar directly, states that those who fail to observe the correct fixed calendar will corrupt all their seasons, so that the years will be dislodged, language that maps with striking consistency onto Enoch's own chapter 80, warning that years shall be shortened and the moon shall alter her order. Two texts independently emphasizing the same specific concern, calendrical and astronomical reliability as a marker of broader cosmic and moral order, using closely parallel language, despite emerging from what manuscript scholars generally treat as separate, though clearly related, compositional traditions. Vanderkam's own analysis suggests this shared calendrical concern likely reflects a genuine, widely held anxiety within certain Second Temple period Jewish communities, particularly the community associated with Qumran itself, regarding calendar disputes that were, by this period, a matter of real and consequential religious controversy, since different Jewish groups of the era followed different calendrical systems, creating genuine practical disputes over when festivals should be observed, disputes serious enough that Vanderkam's own scholarship documents them as a significant source of sectarian division within Second Temple Judaism more broadly. Read this way: Sign 3's emphasis on astronomical and calendrical breakdown reflects a concern that was, for its original audience, considerably more concrete and immediately consequential than a modern reader encountering the text in isolation might assume, tied directly to lived religious practice and community identity rather than existing as purely abstract cosmic symbolism. This context does not weaken the modern data parallel this investigation drew earlier between Sign 3 and the Naval Observatory's rotation data, but it does add an important layer of understanding regarding why this particular sign carried the specific weight it did for the text's original audience, a weight rooted in genuine, documented historical calendar disputes within Second Temple Judaism, not merely in abstract concern about celestial phenomena generally. The modern data parallel remains available to be weighed on its own terms, but understanding the sign's original context, strengthened and confirmed by Jubilees' independent, parallel treatment of the same concern, adds a dimension of historical grounding that makes the ancient claim considerably less arbitrary than it might otherwise appear. With this final piece of comparative context in place, the full case this investigation set out to build, 7 signs, their textual sources across Enoch's own chapters, their confirmation and reinforcement from independent texts including Genesis and Jubilees, their documented and complicated manuscript transmission history, their carefully weighed modern data parallels drawn from major independent institutions, and their most serious scholarly counter-arguments, stands complete. Return, one last time, to where this began. A fragment of goatskin parchment under glass in Jerusalem. Catalog number 4, Q204. 11 copies pulled from a desert cave in 1947. Part of a discovery that reshaped the study of ancient scripture more thoroughly than perhaps any archaeological find of the 20th century. And inside that discovery, buried within a text the 4th century church voted out of scripture, and the following 17 centuries mostly forgot, a sequence its own author called a mystery. 7 conditions, laid out in order, that a reader many centuries removed from the author's own lifetime would need to check against their own lived experience to understand it all. This investigation has tried to do exactly that checking, as carefully and as honestly as the available evidence allows. Not by treating every ancient claim as automatically true because it is old, and not by dismissing every ancient claim as automatically false because it is unfamiliar to modern secular assumptions, but by doing the specific, patient work each individual sign required, tracing its Ge'ez and Aramaic language back through the documented manuscript history, checking it against the strongest and most rigorous modern data available from institutions with no theological interest in the outcome whatsoever, and giving full and honest weight to every counterargument a careful scholar would reasonably raise against the pattern this investigation has traced. What emerged from that work is not a certainty. It could not be, given the genuine and well-documented uncertainties surrounding translation chains, chronology calculations, and the ordinary risk of finding meaningful patterns in data broad enough to accommodate many possible readings. What emerged instead is something more modest and, in its own way, more durable than false certainty would have been. A careful account of what an ancient, nearly lost, eventually recovered text actually says, set honestly alongside what the best available modern evidence actually shows, with every point of genuine agreement and every point of genuine tension between the two, laid out plainly rather than smoothed over for the sake of a cleaner narrative. 4 signs, by the most careful reading this investigation could construct, appear active in the present moment, confirmed not by this investigation's own authority, but by the UNHCR, the Uppsala Conflict Data Program, the Smithsonian, NOAA, NASA, the U.S. Naval Observatory, the World Meteorological Organization, and the IPCC, each using its own language, in its own official reporting, to describe conditions its own data shows breaking from historical pattern. 3 more signs remain, according to the text's own structure, still unfolding or yet to arrive, their eventual confirmation or disconfirmation a matter for whoever continues this kind of careful checking in the years ahead, using whatever data becomes available next. The text that made this investigation possible survived because 2 entirely separate preservation efforts, one through burial in a desert cave and eventual rediscovery, one through unbroken monastery transmission across many centuries of hand copying, both happened to hold, against considerable odds. Across 2,000 years, neither preservation effort could have anticipated converging with the other. That survival is not this investigation's achievement. It belongs to the scribes at Aksum and Debre Libanos, who kept copying a text they could not have known would ever be checked against measurable data, and to whatever combination of dry desert air and historical accident kept 11 fragments intact in a cave for 2 millennia until 1947. What this investigation has offered is simply an attempt to honor that survival by examining it as carefully as it deserves, neither exaggerating its significance nor dismissing it before doing the work required to understand what it actually claims. The 7 signs are documented, sourced, and laid out here in full. What any individual person does with that documentation, how much weight they choose to give it, and what, if anything, they decide to do differently having heard it, is not something this investigation can determine. That decision, as Enoch's own closing chapters insist, belongs to whoever receives these words next. There is one last thing worth saying before this closes, and it has nothing to do with prophecy or chronology or any of the specific data this investigation has spent its length carefully weighing. It has to do with what a person actually does on an ordinary day. The kind of day most of the roughly 2,000 years since this text was written have actually consisted of long stretches of ordinary living between whatever events later generations decide were historically significant. Enoch's own final instruction, buried in its closing chapters and easy to miss beneath the more dramatic material that precedes it, is not a call to constant vigilance or anxious calculation. It is closer to the opposite. Chapter 108, the text's final chapter in most manuscript orderings, closes not with a warning but with a description of what the text calls the portion of the good, those who love the works of righteousness, described as receiving peace and being written down for a good life. Language that reads, after everything the preceding chapters have described, almost startlingly quiet, no further elaboration of coming catastrophe, no additional calculation of timing, just a description of an ordinary kind of goodness, sustained across an ordinary life, treated by the text as the appropriate response to everything it has spent its length warning about. This is worth sitting with because it reframes what this entire investigation has actually been for. Not to produce anxiety about a specific coming date, which the manuscript evidence, honestly examined, cannot responsibly support with the precision such anxiety would require. Not to offer false comfort by dismissing the pattern entirely, which would misrepresent how genuinely the modern data maps onto the ancient claims across at least 4 of the 7 signs. But to offer, as honestly and as carefully as this presentation could manage, the material a person needs to think clearly about an old and difficult text, and then to return, as Enoch's own closing words suggest, to the ordinary work of living well within whatever time remains, however long or short that time turns out to be. The fragment in Jerusalem stays under its glass. The monasteries at Aksum and Debre Libanos continue their centuries-old work of preservation. And whatever comes next, whether it resembles anything in the 7 signs this investigation has traced or turns out to have nothing to do with any of it, will arrive the way it always has, one ordinary day at a time, for whoever is paying attention closely enough to notice. There is a particular kind of humility this material demands, and it is worth naming directly before closing. Every scholar cited throughout this investigation, Vandelay, Fennel, Voskuil, Ashkenazi, Stuckenbrook, Vanderkam, Haile, Rensburg, and every institution referenced, from the UNHCR to Scripps to the IPCC, arrived at their respective findings through years, in some cases entire careers, of patient, specialized work that this presentation has only been able to summarize in compressed form. Any single claim drawn from that work, extracted from its original context and placed alongside a 2,000-year-old text, carries a real risk of misrepresentation, however carefully this investigation has tried to avoid that risk through repeated caveats, acknowledged uncertainties, and direct engagement with counterarguments at every stage. That risk does not disappear simply because the effort to avoid it was genuine. The original sources exist. The manuscripts, the peer-reviewed studies, the institutional reports, and every one of them rewards direct engagement far more than any summary, however careful, ever could. This is, in the end, what Enoch's own closing chapters seem to have understood about their own eventual readers. Separated by centuries and languages and translation chains, the original author could not have anticipated in any detail that the text would need to be checked, tested, and weighed by each generation that encountered it, rather than simply accepted or dismissed on the strength of whoever happened to be presenting it at the time. This investigation has tried to model that checking as honestly as it could. What comes next belongs to whoever continues it. At no point has this investigation argued that any modern event was directly caused by or represents a literal fulfillment of any specific verse in Enoch. The claim has been narrower and, hopefully, more defensible than that. It is a claim about correspondence, that the general shape of condition Enoch's author describes for each of the 7 signs, examined carefully in its original Ge'ez or Aramaic language, matches, with a specificity that goes beyond what generic apocalyptic language alone would predict, the general shape of condition multiple independent modern institutions have documented using their own methodologies, arrived at with no awareness of or reference to the ancient text at all. Consider, one final time, the specific shape of what this investigation actually found across its full length. Not a single dramatic discovery, not one smoking gun that settles the question definitively in either direction, but something slower and, in its own way, harder to dismiss than a single dramatic claim would have been. A pattern built across 7 separate signs, each with its own independent textual source and its own independent modern data trail, none of which depends on any of the others being true to stand on its own merits. Sign 1 stands or falls on the AI safety and biosecurity data, regardless of what happens with Sign 6. Sign 4 stands or falls on the UNHCR and Uppsala figures, regardless of whether Sign 5's chronology calculation holds up under further scrutiny. This structural independence across the 7 signs is itself methodologically significant, because it means the overall case does not rest on any single fragile claim. It rests on the accumulated weight of multiple separately verifiable claims, each one open to individual scrutiny, each one presented here with its own specific sourcing and its own specific limitations honestly disclosed. That is the most this kind of investigation can responsibly offer, and it is offered here in full for whoever chooses to sit with it, check it further, and decide for themselves what it means for the time they have, whatever that time turns out to hold.